Section 1. The Question of Strength. There is a question that has haunted the halls of every forge, every battle barge, every candlelit chamber, where Warhammer lore is spoken in hushed and reverent tones. A question that has sparked debates stretching across years, across codex editions, across entire communities of people who care deeply about gods in power armor. It is a simple question, but the answer is anything but. Who is the strongest Primarch? When most people ask that question, they are thinking about combat. They are picturing two mountains of ceramite and gene-forged muscle colliding somewhere in the ash and ruin of the 41st millennium, and they want to know which one walks away. And that is a fair thing to wonder about. The Primarchs are not ordinary warriors. They are not even extraordinary warriors by the standards of the galaxy's many killing machines. They are something else entirely. They are beings that sit at the boundary between mortal and divine, sons of the Emperor himself, each carrying within them a fragment of the most powerful psychic mind in human history, each shaped by a homeworld, a purpose, a philosophy that set them apart not just from normal humanity, but from each other. Sanguinius, the angel of the Blood Angels, is remembered by most lore masters as the finest individual warrior among the Primarchs. His combat record speaks in thunder. He faced Horus himself, the War Master, at the absolute peak of his chaos-empowered glory, surrounded by the favor of all four dark gods, and he survived long enough to leave a crack in that otherwise impenetrable armor. A crack that the Emperor would later use to end the heresy. That is not a small thing. That is a warrior of staggering, almost mythological personal power. There are accounts of Sanguinius in combat during the Great Crusade that describe him moving with a fluidity and precision that even other Primarchs found difficult to track, his golden wings carrying him across the battlefield in patterns that his enemies could not predict, his blade finding the gaps in armor and the pauses in enemy cadence with the same instinctive accuracy that a master musician finds the notes of a song. He was built for this. Everything about him, from the genetic architecture the Emperor designed to the hellish proving ground of his homeworld Baal, was oriented toward producing the finest possible individual fighter. The Lion, El Johnson of the Dark Angels, fought Leman Russ to a standstill. Two Primarchs, both considered among the finest close combat fighters alive, simply refusing to yield to the other. Neither could put the other down for good. The Lion has fought Konrad Curze multiple times and proved superior in most of those encounters. He has demonstrated tactical and martial brilliance across hundreds of campaigns spanning thousands of years, and his return to the modern 41st millennium has shown that he has not diminished in the slightest. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, was literally designated by the Emperor to serve as a living weapon against any Primarch who needed to be brought to account by force. Not just as a capable fighter, but as the specific instrument of execution for the Emperor's own sons, if it came to that. When Magnus the Red needed to be punished for his catastrophic breach of the Emperor's decree forbidding sorcery, Russ was the one sent. The Emperor's chosen executioner. Given the hardest jobs because he was most reliably capable of completing them. And then there is Angron, the Red Angel, the Lord of the World Eaters, whose raw physical fury in the midst of close combat is almost without peer. The butcher's nails drilled into his skull were slowly destroying his mind, but they were also amplifying his aggression to levels that bordered on supernatural, turning him into a storm of violence that even other Primarchs approached with extreme caution. He was a force of nature in the shape of a demigod, and force of nature is not something you manage easily. You point it at the enemy, and you hope. These are the names that come up first. These are the warriors people think of when they argue about strength in the traditional sense of who wins a duel, and they deserve that reputation. Every single one of them is genuinely fearsome in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. The debates about them are not idle ones. The evidence for each of their places in the upper tier of combat is real and documented across dozens of novels and codices and campaign supplements. But none of them is the answer to the question. Because the question is not who wins the most duels, and the question is not who has the highest kill count in a single engagement, and the question is not even who, in a straight fight between Primarchs, wins the most often. The question is who is the strongest, and strength, it turns out, is a much richer concept than raw combat output. Strength has dimensions that a simple duel cannot measure. It has endurance. It has the capacity to absorb punishment that would end anyone else and simply keep going. It has the stubborn refusal to be permanently removed from the board, no matter what the enemy throws at you. It has the ability to be killed over and over and over again by one of the most creative and sadistic torturers in the galaxy, and then stand back up every single time, not because of machinery or warp corruption or demonic patronage, but because of something deep and biological and unique that lives in the very cells of your body. A gift given to you by your father because he trusted you with it more than any of the others. And it has the quiet, unshakable strength that comes from knowing what you are fighting for and refusing, across millennia and through the worst darkness the universe can produce, to let go of that reason. The strength that does not need to be performed or proved or demonstrated in front of an audience. The strength that operates just as fully when there is no one watching, no glory to be gained, nothing but the cold logic of endurance and the stubborn insistence on remaining who you are. By every measure of genuine strength, there is one Primarch who stands above the rest. He is not the most celebrated in the halls of the Imperium. He does not have the magnetic, almost gravitational charisma of Horus, who could walk into a room and have everyone in it convinced they were his closest friend before he had finished his opening sentence. He does not have the administrative genius of Guillemot, who built a civilization within a civilization while the wider Imperium was still deciding whether it could survive. He will not fill you with existential dread the way the Night Haunter did, whose mere presence in a city made people start locking their windows. And he will not inspire the same breathless awe as the Angel of Baal, spreading his golden wings above a dying battlefield, while the light catches the blood on his sword in a way that looks, somehow, like art. But he is the strongest. He is the one who cannot be killed by any conventional means, and very few unconventional ones. He is the one who took punishment that would have shattered steel and kept asking for more. He is the one whose physical power exceeded every single one of his brothers according to the most credible and consistent accounts. He is the one who, in the end, at the absolute nadir of the heresy, stood between the Emperor on the Golden Throne and a daemon Primarch of near incalculable psychic power, and simply refused to be undone. He killed a being who had made himself the instrument of a chaos god's will through the most straightforward method available. He hit it with a hammer until it stopped moving, absorbing every supernatural assault that could be devised in the process, and died in the act of winning. His name is Vulkan, Lord of Drakes, 18th Primarch, the unbound flame, master of the Salamanders, the physically strongest being in the galaxy short of the Emperor himself, the only one of the Emperor's sons to share his father's unique nature as a perpetual and possibly still standing somewhere out there in the vast dark, waiting for the moment his sons call him home. This is his story. Settle in, because it is not a short one. It stretches from the volcanic shores of a death world most of the galaxy has never heard of, through the blood-soaked depression on Istvan V, where the heresy consumed 3 legions in a single afternoon, through months of systematic torture aboard a Night Lord's prison hulk, through death and resurrection, and death again, and resurrection, and death. One final terrible time, all the way to the very throne of the Imperium itself during the worst siege in human history. It is a story about fire, about endurance, about what it means to be truly, fundamentally indestructible in both body and soul, and about the strangest kind of strength there is, the kind that chooses, again and again, not to give up on the people it is sworn to protect, even when giving up would be easier, even when the evidence that anyone is worth protecting is being systematically dismantled around you, even when a voice in the shape of a brother whispers that compassion is a lie and everything good is eventually destroyed. Vulkan's answer to that whisper, delivered over and over through centuries of evidence, is simple. He refused to agree. And that refusal, maintained with the same steadiness that Nocturne's people bring to the time of trial, every eruption endured, every lost ground rebuilt, every disaster survived, and then walked back from to begin again, is the most powerful thing in the story. Drop a comment right now, telling us where you are watching from and what time it is. Whether you are in bed with the volume down, outside with headphones in while the world moves around you, or somewhere completely unexpected, we want to know. It makes this community feel real. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting. Section 2. Nocturne, the anvil that forged a god. To understand Vulkan, you have to understand Nocturne. Not in the abstract, not the way you understand a planet from a scan or a data slate, or a cartographer's notation that says Death World in parentheses, and leaves it at that. You have to understand it the way its people understood it, the way it felt underfoot and overhead, and in the bones of every person who lived there, the specific texture of a world that had been trying to kill you since birth, and that you had decided, through some combination of stubbornness and cultural inheritance, and perhaps a very specific kind of love, to stay on anyway. Nocturne is a death world. That designation in the Imperium of Man is not given lightly, and is not primarily ceremonial. It is a formal acknowledgement that the natural conditions of a planet are hostile enough to kill experienced warriors, soldiers, and specialists who are not paying constant attention. Not kill in the vague sense of presenting dangers that careful people can navigate around indefinitely, but kill in the specific sense that the planet itself generates lethal hazards as a matter of its normal geological and ecological function. It is a planet that has been classified, even by the hardened standards of the Imperium, as somewhere that you do not go unless you have a very compelling reason and very reliable equipment. And even then, you tread carefully. What makes Nocturne so thoroughly lethal is not any single catastrophic feature, but the way multiple catastrophic features interact with and compound each other in ways that make the planet's surface feel less like terrain and more like a continuous demonstration of how many different ways the physical world can try to end a person. The bedrock of the problem is geological instability at a fundamental level. Nocturne does not have tectonic plates in the same sense that relatively stable terrestrial worlds do. What it has is a geological system that is essentially in a constant state of low-level conflict with itself, fault lines intersecting and pressing against each other, magma chambers rising and falling in cycles that are somewhat predictable in their timing, but highly unpredictable in their specific expression. The ground moves on Nocturne in ways that would be unusual events on other worlds, but are simply Tuesday on this one. Tremors are a constant background condition. Buildings are constructed to flex rather than to resist, because the craftspeople of Nocturne learned long ago that rigid structures fall when the ground moves, and the ground always moves. The settlements of Nocturne are architectural arguments for the value of designed flexibility, and they have been making that argument for millennia. The volcanoes compound everything. Nocturne has many of them, distributed across the planetary surface in a pattern that reflects the deeply fractured nature of the geological substrate. These are not the kinds of volcanoes that emit slow-moving lava flows visible from a safe distance and accompanied by plenty of warning signs. These are volcanoes that operate on shorter timescales and with greater violence, erupting with the stored pressure of magma chambers that have been building heat under crustal pressure for months or years, releasing it with the sudden, decisive force of something that has been patient long enough. The rivers of lava that follow these eruptions do not give a great deal of warning time. They move through terrain that may have been perfectly navigable a few hours earlier, and is now simply a matter of carefully gauging whether the molten rock will reach you before you can get clear of it. Mount Deathfire is the most famous and most significant of Nocturne's geological features, and it earns every syllable of that name with complete honesty. It is one of the largest volcanic structures on the planet, a mountain that does not so much dominate the landscape as define it. Its mass so substantial that it affects the local climate, pulling weather systems toward it, creating zones of ashfall and thermal updraft that extend for significant distances around its base. Its slopes are the specific habitat of the largest and most dangerous of Nocturne's native predators, the fire drakes. These creatures represent one of the most extraordinary examples of evolutionary adaptation to extreme conditions in the known galaxy. They are large, in the way that things become large when size provides advantages that outweigh the cost of maintaining that mass. They are armored in scales that are thick enough and structurally sophisticated enough that most conventional weapons are, at best, temporarily inconvenient. They breathe actual fire, produced by biological organs that process volcanic gases and ambient heat into focused streams of flame that are immediately lethal to anything within range that lacks equivalent fire resistance. They are also intelligent in the patient, strategic way that apex predators become when their environment is complex enough to reward careful decision-making. They choose when to engage and when to withdraw. They are, in short, dangerous in the full and complete sense of that word. Hunting a fire drake is considered by the people of Nocturne to be one of the most serious tests of a warrior's capability. The hide and bones and meat of a fire drake are of significant practical value, and the act of bringing one down is a mark of genuine distinction in a culture that evaluates people by what they can do under pressure. And then there is the time of trial. Nocturne has a moon called Prometheus, which orbits close enough that at certain points in its cycle, it exerts gravitational effects on the planet that compound the already severe geological instability. During the time of trial, volcanic activity across the planet intensifies substantially. Earthquakes become more frequent and more severe. The fire drakes emerge in greater numbers and with greater aggression, responding to the seismic upheaval in the same way that many predators respond to environmental disruption by becoming more territorial and more proactive about threats. The storms associated with the volcanic activity increase in frequency and severity. The landscape itself becomes more actively dangerous in ways that stack on top of the already dangerous baseline. The people of Nocturne have been living through the time of trial for as long as they have been on Nocturne, which is long enough that their culture is built around it rather than against it. Preparation for the time of trial is a normal part of life, not an emergency response. The structures of their settlements are designed to endure it. The social organization of their communities is designed to support collective survival through it. The spiritual framework of the Promethean cult incorporates the time of trial as a central metaphor for the human condition. The period when the world tries hardest to destroy you and the quality of who you are is most clearly revealed. It would be easy to look at all of this and ask why anyone lived there at all. The answer is economic, in part. The same volcanic activity that creates the hazards also brings to the surface the rich mineral veins and strategic materials that make Nocturne important to the wider Imperium. Gems and metals of exceptional quality emerge from the geological violence that also kills people. The threat and the reward are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other, and the people of Nocturne made their peace with that bargain long ago. But the answer is also cultural, and something harder to name than economics. The people of Nocturne stay because Nocturne has made them into the kind of people who stay. They are tough, not in the aggressive, combative way that tough sometimes means. They are tough in the quieter, more substantial way that comes from simply having done hard things repeatedly until hard things became normal things. They are communal because the experience of surviving a volcanic eruption in isolation is almost universally fatal, and the experience of surviving it together is merely very difficult. They are craftspeople because on a world where the quality of your tools determines your chances of survival, craftsmanship is a matter of whether you live. And they carry, in their spiritual and philosophical traditions, an understanding of fire that no world with a gentler geology could have produced. Fire as destroyer, yes, clearly and obviously, but fire as creator too. Fire as the process by which ore becomes metal, by which raw material becomes useful object, by which the old terrain is consumed and the new ground revealed. The circle of fire, as the Promethean cult calls it, is not simply a pretty metaphor. It is a description of what happens on Nocturne every few years, translated into the language of meaning and applied to everything that matters: death and rebirth, destruction and creation. The volcano takes what was there and makes room for what comes next. The smith takes the raw ore and makes it into a blade. The fire transforms, and the transformation is, in the right hands, a gift. This is the world that received an infant Primarch like a blazing stone from the sky. This is why it matters that it was this world specifically, and not some other, more comfortable place. Nocturne did not make Vulkan powerful. The Emperor had already attended to that in the gene lab beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra. What Nocturne did was something more important. It made Vulkan who he was. It gave him a context, a culture, a set of values and relationships and experiences that would define his character far more profoundly than his gene sequence ever could. It gave him Nibel, It gave him the people of Hesiod. It gave him the fire drakes and the eruptions and the Drukhari raids and all the specific textures of a life lived between the volcano and the anvil. It gave him a reason to fight that had nothing to do with duty or destiny or the Emperor's grand plan, and everything to do with the people standing next to him when the ground started to shake. Section 3. Childhood of Fire, Enbel's son. The gestation capsule carrying the infant, who would become the 18th Primarch, descended through Nocturne's atmosphere in fire. The blazing comet of its descent was noticed across the night sky of Hesiod, a streak of brilliant light in a darkness that the volcanic glow already painted in amber and red. The people of Nocturne, whose religious tradition had prepared them for exactly this kind of arrival, interpreted it with the quiet certainty of people who have been expecting something for a long time and recognize it when it finally shows up. The infant was found by a man named Nebel, a blacksmith in the city settlement of Hesiod. The Promethean opus records that Nebel was a man of standing and genuine quality in his community, which on Nocturne meant something specific and earned. Standing in Hesiod was not about blood or wealth or political connection. It was about demonstrated competence and character, in a place where competence and character were tested regularly by the environment itself. Nebel was the best blacksmith in Hesiod, which made him one of the most important people in a settlement, whose survival depended partly on the quality of its tools and the skill of the people who made them. He was a craftsman in the true sense of that word, someone whose work was inseparable from his identity and whose identity was inseparable from his community. The Promethean cult's prophecies had prepared him to recognize what the capsule and its passenger might represent, and he made the choice that the prophecies would have him make. He took the child in. He named him Vulkan, in the tradition of the cult, after the first king of the great fire-resistant Salamanders, a name that was already a statement, already a set of expectations, already a covenant between a community and whatever this infant might become. Vulkan grew quickly. Within 3 years on Nocturne, he had reached full adulthood in both size and strength, becoming larger and more muscular than any man in Hesiod. The people of Nocturne, hardy and physically formidable by the standards of most of the Imperium's worlds, are not small or weak, and within 3 years, the child in Nebel's forge exceeded every one of them in physical capability. That is the kind of development that is simultaneously wonderful and slightly alarming to witness, and Nebel handled it with the equanimity of a craftsman who accepts the material he is given and works with it rather than against it. The important thing is what Vulkan did with those years. He did not simply grow physically. He learned. He watched Nebel work, and he absorbed what he saw with a depth of understanding that no child of 3 years should have been capable of. The accounts describe him asking questions that revealed an intuitive grasp of the principles of metalworking that experienced smiths spent years developing. And then, still in his early years, he began not just replicating what Nebel did, but improving on it, discovering methods and techniques that Nocturne's accumulated tradition of smithing had not yet arrived at, teaching the people who had raised him things that they had not known before. In a matter of months, the boy who had arrived from the sky was advancing his adopted world's technology by observable and significant degrees. There is a quality to this that goes beyond simply being a genius. It is the quality of someone who is paying genuine attention, who cares about the work, not because it will make him famous or powerful or admired, but because the work itself matters, because the things you make with skill and care are better than the things you make carelessly, and better things save lives and enable survival and make the people you love a little safer and a little more capable of facing the world that is trying to consume them. Vulkan loved the forge because the forge was how you helped the people around you in the most direct and practical way available. He loved it before he knew what he was, before the Emperor arrived, before the stars knew his name. That love was the deepest and most authentic thing about him. He also hunted. Nocturne demands that of anyone who grows up on its surface. The great saurians that emerge during seismic upheaval, the fire drakes on the slopes of Deathfire, the various other fauna that Nocturne's hostile ecology has produced, all of them are hazards that the settlements must deal with. Vulkan became, quite quickly, the finest hunter in Hesiod, and then by reputation, the finest hunter on Nocturne. not through simple physical superiority, though that certainly helped. Through the same quality he brought to the forge, complete attention and genuine care about doing things right. The Drukhari came, as they had always come to Nocturne. The Dark Eldar, known to the Nocturnians as Dusk Wraiths, were practitioners of an art form built around the systematic extraction of suffering from unwilling participants. Their raids on Nocturne were not occasional events. They were a structural feature of life on the planet, reliable enough that the settlements had built their entire defensive architecture around the assumption that the Drukhari would come, and that when they did, the only viable response was to hide effectively and hope that the portion of the population that was taken was small enough that the settlement could absorb the loss. That last sentence contains a horror so normalized it is easy to miss. The only viable response was to hide and hope the portion taken was small enough. The people of Nocturne had lived under that calculus for long enough that it was no longer experienced as a crisis. It was simply the way things were. The Drukhari came, people were taken, the survivors rebuilt, and everyone tried to prepare better hiding places for next time. An entire culture, shaped by resilience and endurance and communal strength, that had nonetheless accepted that a portion of its people would be enslaved to sadists on a regular basis, because there was nothing that could be done about it. And then Vulkan stood in the center of Hesiod with his two smithing hammers crossed over his shoulders and waited for them. The Drukhari arrived in their characteristic fashion, the dark lances of their weapons cutting through the settlement's outer defenses, their skimmers sweeping through the familiar streets of a prey community that they had harvested before and expected to harvest again. They found instead a very large person with a hammer who was not hiding. Vulkan killed approximately 100 of them. The figure is repeated consistently across the sources that describe this event. A Primarch, even one who does not yet know what he is, even one who is technically still in the early years of what would be an extraordinarily long life, is not bounded by the same physical limits as a normal human. 100 Drukhari raiders was not an easy fight. It was not a clean fight. It was the kind of fight that leaves marks and costs something real. But it was a fight that Vulkan won, alone, with tools he had made himself for an entirely different purpose. The people of Hesiod emerged from their hiding places and found the raiders scattered and broken. They found a young man standing amid the wreckage, still breathing with hammers in his hands, and a completely calm demeanor that suggested he had not just done something impossible, but had simply done what needed to be done. The change this produced in the community was not immediate, but it was total and permanent. Within weeks, the headmen of the 7 major settlements on Nocturne had made the journey to Hesiod. They swore, collectively, that the old habit of hiding was over, that the calculation which had traded lives for survival was not the only available calculation, that pride was not something that had to be abandoned forever just because survival demanded it. All 7 major settlements of Nocturne, together, making a collective oath that ended an era of passive survival and began an era of active resistance, all because one person chose, without being commanded to and without prior example to follow, to stand when everyone else was practiced in the art of not being seen. That is leadership, not the management of existing systems. The creation, through the simple example of what a single person is willing to do, of a new possibility that the people around them could not imagine existing before it was demonstrated in front of them. The fire-born warrior who would not hide, standing in the center of Hesiod, changing the future of an entire planet by refusing to participate in its resignation. Everything else that comes later in Vulkan's story grows from that moment. From the specific character of a person who grew up in a forge learning how to make things stronger, who learned his first lessons about courage and community from the most practical school available, and who made from all of that the simple decision that the right thing to do was to stand in the middle of it rather than hide from it. A tournament was held in celebration of the victory over the Drukhari. This was the tradition, and on Nocturne, tradition was not mere habit, but the encoded wisdom of generations, the compressed form of everything the community had learned about what helped people survive and thrive and hold together when the world was trying to break them apart. Contests of strength and endurance and craftsmanship, public demonstrations of the virtues that the community valued most, performed in an atmosphere of collective pride and communal solidarity. And it was during that celebration that a stranger arrived. Section 4. the 8-day contest, and the revelation of the Emperor. The stranger was unusual enough to be immediately noticed. His skin was pale in a way that contrasted sharply with the generally dark complexions of the Nocturnians, a product of their world's high radiation environment. His clothing was made of materials that no craftsperson in Hesiod recognized, which is a more significant observation than it might initially seem, because the craftspeople of Hesiod were exceptional by any standard, and had a deep and practical familiarity with materials of all kinds. His bearing was different in ways that were difficult to articulate, but immediately felt. Not threatening, exactly, but substantial. Solid in a way that went beyond the physical. The Promethean opus describes his arrival as creating the feeling that the air became heavier where he stood. Modern readers familiar with Warhammer lore will recognize this as the psychic emanation of the most powerful mind in human history, pressing through a deliberately constructed disguise. The Emperor had come to Nocturne to find his son, and in a decision that reveals something significant about his understanding of who Vulkan was, he had chosen to come not with ceremony and announcement and the overwhelming revelation of what he actually was, but as a stranger in a crowd, a challenge rather than a declaration, a test rather than a summons. The stranger announced, with cheerful certainty, that he could beat anyone present at any contest they cared to name. The crowd laughed. It is human to laugh at that kind of confidence when it comes from someone you do not recognize, and the people of Hesiod knew their champion. Vulkan was the person who had just killed 100 Drukhari with smithing hammers. Who was this pale stranger who thought he could match that? The laughter was not unkind. It was the comfortable laughter of people who believed they already knew the answer to the question being posed. Vulkan accepted the challenge. The terms were simple and absolute. Whoever lost would swear eternal fealty to the victor. No equivocation, no room for interpretation after the fact. Both parties gave their word, and that was enough, because on Nocturne, a person's word was one of the few things the geological instability could not take from them. The competition that followed lasted 8 days, and each day contained multiple contests across every dimension of capability that the Nocturnian tradition valued. Tests of raw physical strength in every form, that strength could be meaningfully measured. Tests of endurance, the sustained application of capability over time, rather than in a single, explosive moment. Tests of craftsmanship and technical mastery, the ability to take raw material and make it into something better than it was. The one contest that the Promethean opus describes with particular specificity is the anvil lift. Both contestants took hold of iron anvils and raised them above their heads and then held them there for half a day. Both of them. Neither one finding a reason to stop. Neither one approaching the limit that would have required the contest to be judged in one person's favor. Half a day of holding iron overhead, in the kind of heat that Nocturne generates as a matter of course, while the settlement around them watched, and the elders of 7 clans calculated what they were seeing and what it meant about the nature of the stranger who had appeared uninvited at their celebration. By the end of the 8th day, every contest that could be devised had been deployed, and the result was the same, a draw. 2 beings of extraordinary capability, neither capable of decisively outperforming the other in any of the categories that Nocturnian culture valued most highly. It was a conclusion that should have been impossible, because Vulkan was the person who had just demonstrated that he was categorically beyond ordinary human limits in every possible way, and the stranger was keeping up with him perfectly. The final contest was a hunt. Nocturne is a world of predators, and of people who have survived those predators by being more capable and more persistent than the prey version of themselves. The hunt is the ultimate test of all the qualities that Nocturne values, because it requires strength and endurance and skill and patience and judgment under pressure, all at once, in an environment that is not controlled and not predictable. The rules were simple. Find and kill the largest salamander you can. Bring the body back. The larger prize wins. Both contestants climbed toward Deathfire. Both were operating in the same terrain, under the same conditions. Vulkan found his quarry with the efficiency of someone who had hunted on this mountain many times before, who knew its moods and its patterns, and the specific habits of the creatures that lived on it. He identified a massive fire drake, assessed it, and brought it down with a single blow from the weapon he had forged, specifically for this contest. The kill was clean and decisive. The prize was immense. Vulkan made his judgment, felt the satisfaction of a well-executed hunt, and began his descent. The volcano had different plans. The ground opened beneath Vulkan. A surge of lava came from fault lines, activated by some seismic event, and Vulkan found himself at the edge of a cliff over molten rock, with one hand holding the rock face and the other hand gripping the tail of his drake, unwilling to let go of his prize even as gravity and heat conspired against him. He hung there for hours. That duration is significant and speaks to something about Vulkan's character that goes beyond simple physical capability. His body was extraordinary, and he could hold that position longer than any normal person. But holding any position for hours over molten rock, with one hand carrying significant additional weight, with the heat rising from below and the volcanic activity making the cliff face itself unstable, is not a simple test of strength. It is a test of will, of whether the thing you are holding onto is worth holding, of how long you are willing to stay in pain for something that matters to you. He felt the grip going. He felt the point approaching where the calculation would become unavoidable. Release the drake or fall with it. Survival or the stubborn insistence on keeping what you came for. He could feel the decision forming, and he had not yet made it, because making it felt like giving something up that he was not ready to give. And then the stranger appeared above him. He had found his own drake. Not just a drake, but the largest fire drake anyone had ever seen. A specimen that clearly, obviously, definitively surpassed Vulkan's prize. Standing at the top of the cliff with this immense creature, the stranger looked down at Vulkan hanging over the lava, and he looked at the drake in his hands. And without a moment of apparent hesitation, he threw the drake into the molten rock below. He cast away the contest-winning prize without using it as leverage, without negotiating, without even pausing to evaluate the strategic implications. He formed a bridge from the body of his prize, and then reached down and took Vulkan's hand and lifted him and his drake straight up. When they returned to the settlement, the elders made the obvious judgment. The stranger had come back from the hunt empty-handed. Vulkan had the body of his fire drake. Vulkan won. Vulkan knelt. He said the words that the Promethean opus records with particular care, because they are the distillation of something essential about who he was. Any man who valued another's life above his own victory, he said, was a man worth serving. The logic is simple, and the implications are enormous. The stranger had the larger prize. The stranger had won by the rules of the contest, but the stranger had chosen to use that prize to save Vulkan's life rather than to secure his own victory. That choice, the specific and concrete demonstration of what the stranger valued most when he had to choose between winning and helping, told Vulkan everything he needed to know about who this person was. He offered his fealty freely before any demands were made. He gave it because he meant it. Because on Nocturne, where people are judged by what they are willing to do and not by what they claim to be, the stranger had just performed the most significant possible act. The Emperor cast off his disguise, and Nocturne understood for the first time what it had been hosting. The legion that had been known as the Dragon Warriors was renamed the Salamanders, the great fire-resistant reptiles of Nocturne, the creatures that lived in the volcano and emerged unchanged. The creatures that bore the name Vulkan had carried since Nibel found him, became the symbol of the 18th Legion, a name that was also a doctrine. A creature that cannot be permanently destroyed by the most extreme natural force on its homeworld, enduring in the fire, coming back from the heat, living in conditions that would end everything else. The Salamanders, the sons of the Primarch, who would eventually prove that the symbol was literally true. Before Vulkan took formal command of his legion, he remained at the Emperor's side for years of direct tutelage. He learned with the same frightening speed and depth of absorption that he had brought to Nibel's forge, but now the subject matter was war, history, science, strategy, the full range of knowledge needed to command superhuman warriors, in service of a galaxy-spanning political project. He studied in the great forges of Mars. He worked alongside the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, absorbing their vast archive of technical knowledge and contributing to it in ways that surprised the tech priests themselves. He came to Mars as a student and left, having given them things they had not known before. He worked alongside Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands Primarch, whose metallic arms and deep love of craft created an immediate bond. They competed constantly at the forge, the competition genuine, the results extraordinary, the friendship that grew from it as close and authentic as any recorded in the pre-heresy lore. Two master smiths with different approaches to the same fundamental problem, making each other better at it by refusing to let the other's last achievement be the definitive one. When Vulkan finally met his legion formally, the Terran-born members who had been fighting in his name without ever meeting him watched this enormous dark-skinned figure in emerald green armor walk toward them with a combination of reverence and wariness, the complicated feeling that comes with meeting the figure around whom your entire identity has been constructed. Vulkan knelt to them, not to receive their homage, not to conduct an inspection. He knelt in honor of the lives they had paid, and the price they had given in service to something that had not yet properly claimed them as its own. He said they were his equals. He said he was not a king requiring demonstrations. He was a smith, and they were the warriors who would carry what he made, and that made them partners. He sought out the mortally wounded Lord Commander Vaughn, the senior Terran-born Salamander, and gave him the broken power claw of the Orc warlord who had struck him down, the symbol of the formal transfer of command, not a trophy for the victor, a gift for the fallen, the recognition that Vaughn had earned it and that Vulkan was taking command not from him, but because of him. That is the character of the 18th Primarch, not the character of the strongest being in the galaxy by raw physical metrics, though he is that. The character of someone who understood, before the galaxy started testing him in more creative ways, that what you are made of is revealed in the smallest choices more clearly than in the largest battles. Section 5. The Great Crusade Warrior, Craftsman, Protector. The Great Crusade stretched across approximately 2 centuries, encompassing thousands of worlds, hundreds of major campaigns, and the combined efforts of 20 Space Marine legions at varying stages of expansion and development. It was the most ambitious military-political project in human history, a systematic attempt to gather the scattered populations of humanity, separated by the dark centuries of the Age of Strife, back into a single civilization that could face the challenges of the galaxy from a position of collective strength. It was brutal and it was costly, and it was also, by the standards of what the Imperium would eventually become, something approaching idealistic in its original conception. The Salamanders under Vulkan were a specific and recognizable presence within this larger project. They were not the most numerous legion. The intensity of Vulkan's recruitment standards, his personal preference for quality over quantity, and the practical realities of Nocturne's population combined to mean that the 18th Legion was consistently smaller in absolute numbers than some of its counterparts. But what the Salamanders had, and what made up for numerical disadvantages in most of the engagements they fought, was a consistency of excellence that very few legions could match. Campaigns that the Salamanders participated in tended to conclude successfully. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but successfully. And the cost, measured in lives lost and infrastructure destroyed and populations displaced, was consistently lower than comparable operations conducted by other legions. This was not accidental. It was the direct expression of Vulkan's philosophy, applied systematically to military operations. That philosophy can be stated simply. The point of the Great Crusade is the people. The worlds being brought into compliance are not trophies or strategic assets to be acquired at any cost. They are communities of human beings, each one with its own history and culture and set of relationships that have developed over the centuries of separation from the wider species. They are the reason the Crusade exists, and winning a campaign while destroying the civilization you were ostensibly liberating is not a victory. It is a different kind of failure, one that the casualty counts and the tactical summaries do not capture, but that the people who live in the wreckage understand perfectly. Other legions did not uniformly share this view. Some of them had operational philosophies that placed much less weight on civilian welfare, and much more on speed, decisiveness, and the minimization of imperial military casualties. From certain perspectives, this was not wrong by the internal logic of the Crusade. Speed mattered. Decisiveness mattered. The lives of Space Marines were, from a certain cold accounting, more strategically valuable than the lives of the civilians they were liberating, because Space Marines were irreplaceable weapons that had taken tremendous resources to produce. Vulkan rejected this accounting, not loudly, not in ways that created open faction politics, or demanded that other legions change their methods. He simply conducted his own operations according to his own values, and let the results speak for themselves. The worlds that the Salamanders brought into the Imperium rarely rebelled. The populations they dealt with understood, in the specific and personal way that people understand things they have experienced directly, that these warriors were not simply a different kind of invader. They were something the propaganda said all Space Marines were, but that most populations only encountered in the Salamanders: genuine protectors. People who would absorb cost on behalf of the people they were fighting for, rather than simply distributing cost to whoever was in range. His craftsmanship during the Great Crusade period reached levels that no purely technical description can fully convey. Vulkan was not simply a very skilled smith. He was someone for whom the act of making things occupied the same relationship to genius that music occupies for the greatest composers, a domain where native ability and deep love of the work and years of practice combined into something that exceeded what analysis could account for. He made things that the best of the Adeptus Mechanicus could not reverse engineer, not because he possessed secret technical knowledge that they did not, but because the quality of attention and care he brought to the work produced results that pure technical process alone could not replicate. The weapons he made for himself and for his legion are described throughout the Horus Heresy novels with a particular kind of reverence, the reverence that the lore reserves for things that are not just powerful, but beautiful. His thunder hammer, Dawnbringer, is perhaps the most famous personal weapon in the Salamander's history, and the accounts of it describe it not merely as a weapon of immense destructive capability, but as an object that feels right in a way that only perfectly made things feel right. The furnace's heart, the custom bolter that accompanied it in Vulkan's standard armament, is described similarly. These were not simply objects of significant material quality. They were expressions of their maker's understanding of what weapons were for, which was the protection of the people who carried them and the people they were fighting for. The friendship between Vulkan and Ferrus Manus deserves more than a passing mention, because it illuminates something essential about both of them and makes the eventual events of Istvan V more affecting than they would be if the relationship were merely professional. They were both smiths, but they were also both people who took the care of their legions seriously in the personal sense, who understood their warriors as individuals rather than as units, who could be found doing things that other Primarchs did not do, like spending time with recovering injured legionaries or attending the funerals of individual warriors rather than only the formal rites for senior officers. Their friendship was built on shared work and mutual respect, and the genuine delight of finding someone whose passion for the same craft matched your own, and it was authentic in a way that the lore preserves with particular care. One campaign in particular from the Great Crusade era illuminates both Vulkan's character and the tensions that would eventually contribute to the larger catastrophe. The world designated 1546, known locally as Kara Atan, was a compliance operation conducted jointly by the Salamanders and the Night Lords under Konrad Curze. On paper, this was a collaboration between two legions, working toward the same imperial objective. In practice, it was the convergence of two fundamentally incompatible philosophies about how to accomplish that objective, placed in the same operational context, commanded by two Primarchs who had reached diametrically opposite conclusions about the nature and value of human life. Curze's approach, as it had been on every world the Night Lords encountered, was systematic terror. He and his legion killed in public and in visible ways, calculated to maximize the fear response in the remaining population. Compliance through the simple arithmetic of convincing people that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of surrender. It worked. By any purely operational metric, it worked extremely well. Vulkan found out about the city. The Night Lords had killed an entire city's population to demonstrate their seriousness to the surrounding region. Not combatants, not the city's military or political leadership. Everyone. As a message, he was furious. Not in the performance of outrage sense that political figures sometimes deploy, in the deep, personal, genuinely felt sense that the word usually means. He confronted Curze directly and personally, with the accumulated force of someone who had grown up watching his community hide from slavers, and had made the choice to stand in the center of Hesiod and face them so that nobody else had to be taken, and who could not see any meaningful difference between what the Drukhari had been doing and what the Night Lords had just done. Curze's response was philosophical. He argued that fear was the most honest and effective form of governance, that the alternatives were hypocritical in ways that terror was not. He was, in a horrible way, internally consistent. Vulkan made a formal complaint. He reported Curze's conduct to Horus and to Dorn. The complaint did not produce immediate actionable consequences, but Vulkan made it anyway. Not because he expected it to immediately change anything, because it was wrong, and the record should reflect that someone had said so. This is a kind of courage that does not get celebrated in the same way that martial courage gets celebrated, but it is real, and it matters. Speaking truth to power, in a context where power has made clear it is not particularly interested in truth, is harder than facing an enemy you can fight with a hammer. The period before the heresy also contained interactions between Vulkan and Horus that take on retroactive significance. Vulkan had forged the hammer Dawnbringer with the intention of presenting it to the War Master as a gesture of brotherhood and loyalty. He had planned this gift, and then, standing before Horus, he felt something he could not name or articulate, a darkness that had not been there before, and he put the hammer away. Not because he had proof of betrayal, not because he had a tactical reason, but because something in the darkness he perceived around Horus made the gift feel wrong. He kept Dawnbringer. That instinct would eventually prove prophetic in the most complete way possible. Section 6. The Road to Istvan V. Shadow Before the Storm. The gathering at Istvan V was, on paper, a coalition assembled for the purpose of bringing Horus Lupercal to account. The War Master had declared himself, had conducted the viral bombing of Istvan III against his own loyal troops as the opening atrocity of the heresy, and the Imperium's response was the assembly of 7 legions for a punitive expedition. 4 legions were openly traitor: the Sons of Horus, the World Eaters under Angron, the Death Guard under Mortarion, and the Emperor's children under the daemon-possessed Fulgrim. These were the declared enemy, the force already entrenched on Istvan V's surface, waiting for the loyalist assault. They were formidable. They had numbers and prepared positions, and the tactical advantage that comes from defending ground you have already fortified. Against them, the first wave of 3 loyalist legions would land and engage: the Iron Hands under Pharasmanis, the Salamanders under Vulkan, and the Raven Guard under Corax. Behind them, the second wave of 4 supposedly loyal legions would arrive to shift the balance and complete the engagement: the Night Lords of Konrad Curze, the Iron Warriors of Perturabo, the Word-Bearers of Lorgar, the Alpha Legion of Alfarius. All 4 had already, in secret, pledged themselves to Horus. They were positioned as allies and had prepared themselves as executioners. The trap was built and waiting. The numbers for the first wave were, on paper, difficult but manageable. Approximately 30,000 traitor legionaries against approximately 40,000 loyalists of the first wave. Difficult odds, but within the range that the Emperor's finest warriors had handled before. The calculations assumed the second wave would balance the equation. Those calculations were fatally wrong. The first wave landed and fought. Ferris drove into the center of the traitor lines with the force of someone who has decided that the outcome matters less than reaching his target. His need to confront Fulgrim personally, the betrayed brother who had been his closest rival and friend among the Primarchs, was overriding the tactical judgment that had made him one of the finest commanders of his generation. Vulkan and Corax maintained their flanks with more discipline, trying to hold coherent positions in terrain that was being contested from multiple directions simultaneously. The fighting was brutal in the way that fighting between Space Marines is always brutal, neither side capable of being stopped by anything less than complete destruction of the forces arrayed against it. The traitor legions were dug in and motivated. The loyalists were fighting hard and taking ground at significant cost. The engagement was going as well as could be expected under the circumstances. And then the second wave arrived. The Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Word-Bearers, the Alpha Legion descended on the Loyalists from behind. The second wave that should have been reinforcement was annihilation, wearing the wrong colors. 4 fresh legions falling on 3 that had already been fighting, in terrain that had been prepared, by enemies who had been planning this for far longer than anyone loyal had known. There was no front line anymore. There was no position to defend. There was simply the chaos of betrayal from every direction. 4 fresh legions falling on 3 that were already spent, in terrain that had been prepared by enemies who had been planning this for far longer than anyone loyal had known. The Iron Warriors deployed nuclear warheads, tactical atomic strikes against a surface covered with their own allies, as well as the loyalists they were targeting, because to Perturabo's legion, acceptable casualties in the pursuit of a clear tactical objective included the forces nominally on their own side. The mathematics of annihilation applied with Perturabo's cold and systematic precision. The nuclear strikes should have killed Vulkan. By any reasonable assessment of the physics involved, they should have ended him the same way they ended everything else within their radius. Vulkan survived. His perpetual nature, the same extraordinary cellular regeneration that he shared only with his genetic father, reasserted itself against a level of physical destruction that should not have left anything recognizable behind. He regenerated. Not instantly, not without damage, not in a way that felt like nothing, but he regenerated. And he came back to consciousness on the black sand of Istvan V, surrounded by hundreds of Iron Warriors and Night Lord's warriors, who were trying to confirm that the unconscious body they were dealing with was actually permanently dead, rather than temporarily incapacitated. He fought until he could not stand. He was stabbed and shot and struck down again and again and again. Not knowing yet what he was, not yet understanding that every death was something he would come back from, he simply fought because that was the only thing left to do. And eventually, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, he lost consciousness for the last time on that field. Konrad Curze found him. The Night Haunter, whose specific hatred of and philosophical obsession with Vulkan had been building since their confrontation on Kara-Atan, recognized an opportunity that was perfectly tailored to his particular obsessions. He took Vulkan prisoner. He had him chained. And he brought him aboard the Night Lord's flagship. The survivors of the Salamanders, those few hundred warriors who made it off Istvan V, found themselves without a Primarch and without a majority of their legion. They did not disband. Chief among the survivors who maintained coherence was Artellus Numion, commander of the Pyre Guard, Vulkan's personal honor guard. Numion refused to accept that Vulkan was simply gone. He had no evidence to support that position. The evidence available overwhelmingly supported the opposite conclusion. But Numion's refusal was based on something deeper than evidence, the conviction that fire does not permanently consume what has been forged properly to endure it. He kept the remnant together. He kept looking. Section 7. The Drop Site Massacre. What the numbers mean. The full scale of what happened at Istvan V only becomes apparent when you stop trying to trace any single person's experience through it and look at the whole picture at once. Approximately 83,000 Salamanders went to Istvan V, a similar number of Raven Guard, 10,000 Iron Hands. Those three legions, more than 100,000 Space Marines, faced the combined and overwhelming force of 8 legions in total when the betrayal was complete. More than 200,000 warriors fought and died across those black sands, in an engagement that lasted long enough for the scale of the catastrophe to reveal itself slowly rather than all at once. The Salamanders were, among the 3 loyalist legions, caught in the trap, the most completely destroyed. The Raven Guard suffered terribly, but Korax managed to extract thousands of survivors. The Iron Hands lost Ferrus Manus himself, a wound from which the legion would not truly recover for 10,000 years. The Salamanders, for reasons that include the specific targeting they faced and the nature of the terrain they were defending, were ground down to almost nothing, a handful of survivors. A few companies' worth of warriors out of a legion that had numbered in the tens of thousands. Ferrus Manus died on Istvan V. He died in the way he had insisted on dying, in personal combat with Fulgrim, seeking the confrontation that his anger and his grief demanded. Whether he understood by the time it happened that the confrontation had been part of what Horus had planned, that his predictable need to confront his betrayed friend had been factored into the trap as a variable to be exploited, is unknown. His head was taken by Fulgrim as a trophy. The Gorgon, who had been one of the most formidable Primarchs in raw physical terms and one of the finest engineers of the entire crusade, was gone. And with him went the closest friendship Vulkan had ever formed among his brothers. For the Salamanders specifically, Istvan V was not simply a military defeat. It was the near total destruction of everything that Vulkan had spent decades building, the warriors he had trained and fought alongside and forged weapons for. The captains who knew his methods and carried his philosophy into every engagement. The living expression of the Promethean creed in action on the battlefield. Almost all of it, destroyed in a single afternoon on a volcanic plain far from Nocturne. And yet it did not end there, because the remnant held, because Numion refused to stop. Because the qualities Vulkan had built into his legion were exactly the qualities needed to survive a catastrophe of this scale and keep going. Endurance, community, the refusal to accept that the fire had gone out, just because you could not currently see it burning. The survivors, scattered and battered and wildly outnumbered by everything they would need to face in the years ahead, kept the Salamanders alive as an entity. They carried the gene seed of their fallen brothers. They protected the knowledge of the Promethean creed. They stayed together around the belief that their Primarch was not permanently gone, that the unbound flame that defined him could not simply be extinguished by nuclear warheads and the Night Haunter's sadism. They were right, but the proof of that would take longer to arrive than anything that was reasonable to ask of a force already pushed to its absolute limits. Section 8. The torture that could not break him. The Torture of Vulkan by Konrad Curze lasted several months and constitutes one of the most psychologically rich and philosophically dense sequences in the entire Horus heresy. It is remarkable not primarily because of what was done to Vulkan, though what was done to him was extraordinary in its creativity and its systematic viciousness. It is remarkable because of what it failed to accomplish, and because of what Curze discovered in the process of attempting it. He could not kill Vulkan. Konrad Curze was not a casual torturer. He was not someone who applied pain in crude and unsophisticated ways. He was, by the lore's reckoning, one of the most gifted close combat fighters among the Primarchs, a being of tremendous physical capability who had spent his entire life using violence and the threat of violence as his primary tools of both governance and warfare. He was extremely good at ending things. In the specific and practiced sense, he was someone who understood the body's limits and how to push comprehensively beyond them. He cut off Vulkan's head. Vulkan grew it back. He ripped out Vulkan's throat with improvised tools. Vulkan regenerated. He stabbed him through the heart. Vulkan came back. He had him eviscerated. Vulkan returned. He had him shot at close range by hundreds of bolters simultaneously. Vulkan recovered. He left him in the venting shaft of the flagship's engine, exposed to temperatures that would have turned normal armor into slag and normal flesh into ash. Vulkan came back. He threw him, stripped of everything, into empty space. Into the vacuum, into the cold, into the silence. Vulkan regenerated even from that. Over several months, the Night Haunter killed Vulkan over and over and over again, exploring with increasing desperation every method he could conceive of to produce a permanent end. And every time, the answer was the same. A cell. A recovery. Vulkan waking up, still alive, still defiant, still looking at his torturer with eyes that did not carry the thing Curze needed most to see, because that was what the torture was really about. Not simply ending Vulkan, though Curze genuinely wanted that. It was about breaking him. About getting Vulkan to confirm, under the most extreme pressure that could be applied, the thesis that drove everything Konrad Curze did. Curze had a thesis. He had held it for his entire life, had built his entire operational philosophy around it, and had derived from it both his methods and his misery. The thesis was this: beneath every claim of virtue, every act of compassion, every expression of care for others, there is a foundation of self-interest and survival instinct that will be revealed under sufficient pressure. Fear is honest. Love is a lie. Compassion is performance. Pain is the only medium through which truth becomes accessible, because pain strips away everything that conscious minds use to maintain the preferred narrative about themselves, and leaves only what is actually there. He had been shaped by this thesis on Nostromo, the lightless industrial world where he had grown up, and where he had become the vigilante executioner who imposed order through the simplest possible means, which was making people more afraid of disobedience than they were of whatever they had been doing. He had built his entire legion around it. The Night Lords were the amplified expression of Curze's belief that terror was the most honest and effective form of governance. Vulkan represented the specific, personal challenge to this thesis that Curze found most difficult to dismiss. because Vulkan was not a naive idealist who had been sheltered from the galaxy's cruelty. He was a person who had grown up on a death world under constant existential threat, who had stood against slavers and predators since before he was old enough to fully articulate why, who had lost his legion and witnessed the murder of his closest friend, and survived months of torture that would have broken anything that could be broken. He was not compassionate because he had not been tested. He was compassionate despite the tests. That was the part Curze could not explain away. The battle of wills between these two Primarchs during those months is one of the purest expressions of their respective worldviews in the entire lore. Curze believed in nothing so deeply as the idea that nothing was worth believing in. His entire psychology was built around the expectation of collapse, the certainty that beneath every virtue was a weakness, waiting to be found. Vulkan would not give him the collapse he needed. He endured death after death after death, each one preceded by suffering of a kind that the human mind has difficulty processing, and he came back from each one as himself. The same person who had stood in the center of Hesiod when the Drukhari came. The same person who had refused to let go of his fire drake even hanging over molten rock. The same person who had knelt before the Emperor, not because he was required to, but because he meant it. There is a moment in the novel Vulkan Lives that is among the most revealing in the entire sequence. Curze, during a meal, loses his characteristic composure entirely and drives a fork into Vulkan's heart in a moment of pure, frustrated rage. The methodical philosopher of terror, the architect of systematic intimidation, reduced to stabbing his prisoner with cutlery because nothing else has produced the result he needs. Vulkan comes back from this too. But the image of Curze in that moment, stripped of his composure by the one thing he truly cannot handle, which is the existence of something that will not confirm his worldview, is perhaps the most revealing single image of the Night Haunter in the entire lore. One of the most extraordinary aspects of this period is that Vulkan had no idea he was a perpetual until the evidence of repeated resurrection made it undeniable. He had lived his entire life, including the Great Crusade and the entire catastrophe of Istvan V, without knowing that he literally could not be permanently killed by conventional means. He had believed himself mortal. He had fought at Istvan, believing that he could die there, and it would be final. The discovery of his true nature, made in the worst possible circumstances by the worst possible messenger, was disorienting in a way that is difficult to fully imagine. Being told by your sadistic torturer that the reason he cannot kill you is that you are essentially immortal, in the middle of months of systematic killing and revival, is not a revelation that arrives with any obvious comfort attached to it. But once Vulkan understood what he was, he could choose what to do with it. He could focus his will on the regenerative process and accelerate it. He could use the knowledge of his own indestructibility as a tactical reality to be worked with, rather than simply a horror to be experienced passively. He could turn what had been done to him, the revelation of an inhuman capacity for endurance, into something that served his survival rather than his captor's entertainment. Eventually, through escape attempts, the intervention of Korax and elements of the Raven Guard, and the extraordinary sequence of events that would bring him to Macragge, Vulkan got away. His re-entry through the planet's atmosphere burned away all recognizable features of his body, leaving a carbonized ruin that the ultramarines who found it were uncertain was even alive until it started regenerating in front of them. He was not well. The months of torture had done something to his mind that his body's extraordinary regenerative capacity could not simply fix on a cellular level. He was violent and incoherent, unable to communicate, attacking anyone who came near him. The mental damage inflicted by death and revival, repeated more times than organic consciousness is designed to experience, had fractured something in him that would take significant time to address. And in the background, the unresolved thread of what had happened aboard Curze's ship was making itself felt. The bond that forms between two beings who have spent months in the kind of proximity that torture creates is strange and real, and Vulkan could sense when the Night Haunter was nearby. Curze, who had arrived on Macragge by way of a boarding action gone wrong aboard the Dark Angel's flagship, was very much nearby. The battle that followed, Vulkan hunting Curze through an entire city while in an unstable mental state, at one point having his head shot off by Curze's weapons and regenerating before his body hit the ground, was eventually interrupted by John Grammaticus carrying a piece of fulgurite, a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic discharge, crystallized into natural glass. Grammaticus, working against the instructions of the Cabal that employed him and under the influence of Eldrad Ulthran's contrary guidance, drove the Fulgurite into Vulkan's heart. The Fulgurite stripped Vulkan of his perpetual nature, at least temporarily. He died. His sons carried his body to Macragge, where Guilliman placed him in a stasis capsule handcrafted for the purpose, with 2 words carved into its side, "Unbound Flame." And the few hundred surviving Salamanders stood watch over their Primarch, in the quiet belief that those words meant exactly what they said. Deeper into the Great Crusade, what the records preserve. There are things about the Salamanders during the Great Crusade that the broad strokes account tends to pass over in the interest of getting to the heresy faster. And they matter. They matter because the character of the Legion was forged in this period as surely as Vulkan's weapons were forged in his personal smithy, and understanding what they were before the catastrophe makes the catastrophe itself carry more weight. The 18th Legion before Vulkan found them was called the Dragon Warriors. They were a legion operating without their genetic Primarch, building their culture and their doctrine from the materials available to them. What they had were Terran-born warriors carrying Vulkan's gene seed without knowing who Vulkan was or where he might be found, and Imperial Army commanders giving them assignments that the Crusade required filling. What they became, without the context their Primarch would eventually provide, was a force that fought competently, but without the specific character that Vulkan's influence would eventually give them. When Vulkan arrived, he did not arrive small. He came with 3,000 new initiates recruited from Nocturne, arriving exactly when his legion needed them most. Lord Commander Cassian Vaughn had been leading the 18th in a desperate defense against an orc horde near the Terrace Division. 19,000 Space Marines holding against millions of orc raiders and their fleet of rocks, buying time for the evacuation of 3 entire planetary populations. They had paid an enormous cost for that defense, and then their Primarch arrived. Not with grand declarations, not with ceremonies of claiming, with warriors and weapons and the immediate practical intention of solving the problem in front of him. The orc horde was destroyed. The populations that had been evacuated survived because of what the Legion had done, and the Legion's survival in turn was secured by what their Primarch brought with him. That arrival set the tone for everything that followed. Vulkan's first act as Primarch of his Legion was to come when they needed him and bring what they needed him to bring. His last act before the heresy, standing in the Rot on Prometheus with Tekel and making the decision about the weapons, was a continuation of the same logic, thinking about what his Legion would need, doing the thing that required the most of him, and accepting the cost. The campaign on 1544, designated Caldera, and known locally as Ibsen, showed something specific about how Vulkan fought and how he thought. The world was being contested by Eldar, who had established a garrison there, and the Salamanders were deployed alongside the Iron Hands and the Death Guard for the compliance action. The Eldar were not simply soldiers to be eliminated. They were a civilization with their own presence on the world, interacting with the primitive human tribes who had settled there during the Dark Age of technology. The human tribes did not welcome the Imperial invasion. From their perspective, the beings they had lived alongside for generations were being attacked by strangers who insisted they were liberators. Vulkan navigated this with the patience and intelligence that his critics would never have predicted from a being who could have simply ordered the destruction of all opposition and been done with it in a fraction of the time. He engaged with the human tribes. He understood, through encounter rather than assumption, what their lives were and what they valued and why they were making the choices they were making. And at some point in that campaign, in circumstances that the lore preserves with characteristic obliqueness, he encountered what appeared to be a remembrancer, but was later understood to be a psychic projection of the Emperor himself, guiding him toward a webway portal that would prove significant in ways that only became clear much later. The Caldera campaign was a compliance action. By the strictly military metric, it succeeded. But what Vulkan took away from it, the understanding that the people on any given world were not simply obstacles between the Crusade and its objectives, but the reason the objectives mattered, was something that no purely military campaign could have taught him. You had to actually deal with people. You had to actually be present in the reality of what they were experiencing, rather than observing it from tactical distance. Vulkan was present in that reality in a way that very few of his brothers chose to be, and it made him better at everything he was supposed to do. His craftsmanship during this period reached forms that the lore describes in terms that professional smiths have noted with real appreciation. He was not simply making weapons. He was advancing the technical understanding of weaponsmithing itself, discovering approaches that had not previously existed, and teaching them to the Legion's artificers. Every salamander becoming a capable smith in his own right, able to maintain and repair his own equipment without depending entirely on the tech marines, was not simply a logistical convenience. It was an expression of the Promethean value of self-reliance made practical. And it meant that when salamanders went to war, the equipment they carried had been personally cared for in a way that created a different relationship between warrior and weapon, not a tool picked up and put down, something made and maintained and understood. The armor that Vulkan wore personally, the Draken scale, is perhaps the clearest single expression of his craftsmanship as applied to his own protection. It was not simply very good armor. It incorporated the skull of the fire drake Kezere on its shoulder, the creature that had been the prize of the 8-day contest with the Emperor, carried forward into every subsequent engagement as a declaration of origin. When the Salamanders painted their armor and adopted their iconography, they were drawing on Vulkan's personal history as the common reference point for everything the Legion meant. And the Furnace's heart, the plasma pistol that Ferrus Manus made and gave to Vulkan as a gift of brotherhood. Vulkan carried this weapon despite not particularly favoring plasma pistols. He carried it because Ferrus had made it. Because the object carried the relationship in it, the friendship expressed through craft, and putting it down would have felt like a betrayal of something that mattered more than tactical preference. After Istvan V, after Ferrus died on those black sands, that weapon became something different. A carried absence, a reminder of who was gone and why. The Promethean Creed in practice. The Promethean cult is described in the lore in fairly broad terms. Self-reliance, self-sacrifice, the circle of fire, the symbolism of the forge and the hammer. But it is worth slowing down and actually inhabiting what this looks like when it is expressed in the daily practice of the Salamanders chapter, because the gap between a stated philosophy and the living practice of it is enormous. And the Salamanders are unusual in the degree to which the practice matches the statement. Before every battle, a salamander has a scar burned into his body. Not cut, burned. The symbolism is specific and deliberate. Fire, in Nocturnian cosmology, is not simply a symbol of destruction. It is the force that transforms, that makes things into what they are meant to be, by burning away what they do not need. The ore enters the furnace as ore, and comes out as steel. The blade enters the coals as metal and comes out as a weapon. The salamander enters combat, and the scar acknowledges that combat changes you, that you will emerge as something different from what you were, and that this is not a bad thing, but the nature of the process. After the battle, if the warrior survives, another scar is added. Veteran salamanders, those who have served for centuries and thousands of engagements, have scars covering their entire body. The face is the last surface to receive them, added only after every other available surface has already been marked. Veterans who have been through that much tend to look like walking records of their own history, the physical evidence of everything they have endured written on their skin in fire's language. Their eyes are red, not a metaphor, literally red, burning with a reflected or internal light, the result of a gene seed interaction with Nocturne's extraordinary radiation levels. And their skin is black, a complete, total blackness that goes beyond normal variation. Again, the result of the melanchromic organ, responding to the same radiation over generations. Warriors who look like they were pulled from a forge fire themselves, whose appearance reflects the world that made them. They live among their people between campaigns. This is not common. Most Space Marine chapters maintain the deliberate distance from normal humanity that their transformation from mortal men into engineered warriors seems to demand, the psychological gap as well as the physical one. The Salamanders do not. They maintain bastions in each of Nocturne's 7 sanctuary cities, and they are present in those communities in ways that make them not simply warriors who occasionally visit, but actual members of the communities in question. The chapter's leaders serve as leaders of the civilian settlements. The Salamanders know their people as individuals, as members of families, as participants in the ongoing life of a world that is constantly threatening to kill everything on it. This closeness has a practical dimension that manifests most clearly in combat. When a salamander chooses to advance through the more dangerous route to keep civilians away from the fighting, this is not an abstract commitment to a principle. It is a decision made by someone who, in the most literal sense, knows who is on the other side of that choice. The families they are protecting are not statistics. They are people with names who exist in the salamander's personal experience. The cost of allowing them to come to harm is not a theoretical moral failure. It is a personal one. The honor scars are central to the ritual life of the chapter in ways that extend beyond the pre- and post-battle burning. There are ceremonies for advancement, for loss, for significant events in the chapter's collective history. The Canticle of Immolation is read by the Igniacs, the Salamander's chaplains, during these ceremonies, connecting current practice to the ancient words that Vulkan himself composed. When a Forge Father is chosen and abandons his own name, the ceremony acknowledges both what is being given up and what is being taken on. The name Vulkan is not simply a title, it is a transformation. The warrior who walks into the ceremony is not the warrior who walks out, any more than the ore that enters the furnace is the ore that comes out. The Promethean cult also had a very specific and practically significant effect during the heresy. The word-bearers could not get in. The Legion of Lorgar, whose specific campaign during the Crusade involved seeding chaos cults within other legions, and whose methodology had successfully established warrior lodges in multiple forces they subsequently corrupted, found the 18th completely impervious, not through vigilance, not through specific countermeasures, but because the Promethean Creed occupied the psychological and spiritual space that the word-bearer's influence needed in order to take root. A legion that had a genuine, living spiritual tradition with deep roots in its founding culture did not have the vacant space that corruption needed to move into. The fortress monastery of the 18th was, functionally, the best defended door in the Crusade, the disappearance, and the long wait. Around 1,000 years after the heresy ended, Vulkan disappeared. The lore is deliberately sparse about the specifics. Some sources say he led his chapter for 3 full millennia before departing. Others place his departure closer to the period of the second founding. The discrepancy probably reflects either deliberate ambiguity in the setting or the natural inconsistency of sources separated by 10,000 years of imperfect record-keeping, which is, appropriately, how history in the Imperium actually works. What is agreed is that he left behind the Tome of Fire, and that the tome contained both the locations of the 9 artifacts and the prophecy of his return. Before leaving, he met with Tekel, his forge master, and had the conversation about the weapons vault. The decision to destroy rather than preserve, and Tekel's successful argument that preservation with safeguards was better than total destruction, produced the framework that has defined the Salamander's mission for 10,000 years. The condition he placed on his return is worth thinking about carefully, because it is unusual in the context of Primarch behavior. Most Primarchs who are absent from the current era of the 41st millennium are simply missing or dead, or trapped in states that do not allow for voluntary action. Vulkan's absence is a deliberate choice. He is somewhere. He knows what the condition for his return is. He is waiting to see if his sons will meet it. This is not passivity. It is a continuation of the same logic that defined his entire approach to leadership, demonstrating something and letting the demonstration do the work. The 8-day contest was Vulkan demonstrating who he was before he knew the stranger across from him was his genetic father. The Promethean Creed is a demonstration of values expressed through action rather than simply stated. The Artifacts test is Vulkan asking his sons to demonstrate who they are through sustained, costly, long-term effort, rather than through single dramatic acts that can be performed in isolation from a warrior's overall character. The search for the artifacts requires everything the Promethean Creed teaches. Self-reliance. The Forge Father often operates alone or with very small forces in extremely dangerous regions. Self-sacrifice. Stan has lost warriors. He valued deeply in pursuit of single clues that sometimes prove to be dead ends. Endurance. The search has been ongoing for 10,000 years. The ability to be wrong, to adjust, to continue. Stan went to the world called Zero, expecting to find a lead on the Unbound Flames location, and instead found the Alpha Legion, who had planted the intelligence as a trap. He survived, destroyed the Alpha Legion's local operation, and pushed further into Imperium Nihilus, looking for the next clue. The moment when all 9 artifacts come home to Nocturne will be, if the Tome of Fire is to be believed, a moment of judgment. Not a celebration, not an automatic trigger for Vulkan's return, a judgment. He will look at what his sons have become across 10,000 years of his absence and decide whether they are the warriors he intended to make them, whether the fire he put in them has been maintained or has gone out. Given 10,000 years of evidence, the answer seems likely to be yes. But the fact that it is framed as a question is itself a statement about Vulkan. He is not a Primarch who expects his sons to be perfect because he made them, and therefore they must be. He is a smith who knows that what comes out of the forge depends on how carefully it has been tended, and that no amount of good initial material guarantees a good final product if the process is neglected. He gave them everything he could. He left them tools and wisdom and a mission, and now he waits to see what they did with it. The scale of physical power. When the lore says Vulkan is the physically strongest of the Primarchs, it is worth spending some time with what that actually means, because the claim exists alongside descriptions of beings like Angron, the Daemon Primarch, who is literally possessed by the Butcher's Nails, and the accumulated rage of a Chaos God's attention, and Sanguinius, who is described as capable of deeds of physical strength that defy ordinary measurement. The 8-day contest provides a specific and useful reference point. Vulkan and the Emperor held iron anvils above their heads for half a day without finding a reason to stop. Neither of them showed signs of fatigue that would have ended the hold. Both chose to put the anvils down rather than being forced to. This specific data point places Vulkan's sustained static strength at a level that requires approximately half a day of maximum effort to approach even a potential ceiling. And even then, the ceiling was not found. It was abandoned. The Warhammer Doomtremor, which Vulkan forged after losing Dawnbringer during the War of the Beast, was so heavy that fully armored Space Marines in Terminator Plate, the heaviest and most physically reinforced personal armor in the Imperium, could not lift it. Terminator armor is not light. The warriors inside it are not small or weak. They are among the most physically capable beings in human space. Vulkan's secondary weapon, the weapon he forged when his primary was lost, was literally beyond their ability to handle. His first act with Erdrakul, the hammer forged during his unconscious resurrection at Deathfire, was to use it against Ferrus Manus's metallic arms during the Siege of Terra. The arms of Ferrus Manus, made of the substance called necrodermis, taken from a dormant necron, something that the Gorgon's own gene-enhanced biology was unable to sever, even using all the considerable tools available to one of the most physically capable Primarchs who had ever lived, were shattered by Erdrakul's impact. Not cut, not damaged, shattered. The battle against Magnus the Red endured across multiple deaths and recoveries, sustained against an opponent of essentially unlimited psychic power, was not simply a test of indestructibility. It was a test of raw determination to continue applying physical force against a target that was doing everything possible to make the application of that force impossible. Magnus killed Vulkan's body, while Vulkan's hammer kept moving. The attack that was actively unraveling Vulkan's DNA, working at a molecular level to destroy the very structure that allowed his cells to regenerate, coincided with the blow that ended the engagement. He was swinging the hammer while literally disintegrating. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The physically strongest of the Primarchs, with a weapon that can permanently kill what should be permanently unkillable, still swinging, while his own cellular structure was being actively destroyed by the focused attention of a being empowered by a chaos god. The blow landed. The ritual collapsed. The Siege of Terra's internal threat was neutralized. If the question of who is strongest were decided simply by asking who kept going the longest under the worst conditions, the answer is the same person the lore has always pointed toward, the smith from Nocturne who does not stop. The War of the Beast and the final recorded act. The War of the Beast, set approximately 1,000 years after the heresy, is one of the most significant conflicts in the period between the heresy and the current 41st millennium, and Vulkan was present for it. The Beast was an orc warlord of unprecedented scale and capability, a being who managed to unify the normally anarchic and faction-prone orc species to a degree that had never previously been achieved and would not be achieved again. The invasion launched under the beast's direction threatened the Imperium in ways that had not been seen since Horus's forces stood outside the Imperial Palace. Multiple worlds were lost. The Phalanx itself, the mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, was captured. The situation was genuinely desperate, in the kind of specific and measurable way that the Warhammer 40,000 setting only rarely achieves. Vulkan went to Caldera again, the world he had first encountered during the Crusade, now transformed by centuries of Imperial presence into something very different from the primitive settlement he had known. He had lost Dawnbringer in earlier fighting. He forged Doomtremor as a replacement, the hammer so massive that no ordinary warrior could even lift it, which says something about what Vulkan considered an appropriate weight for a working weapon. The hammer could absorb incoming energy attacks and redirect them at the enemy, which is an interesting capability in the context of a being who was already essentially impossible to kill. Now the things that would have damaged him could instead be redirected outward. His final recorded action in this period was boarding the beast's Temple Gargant, a mobile war machine described as gigantic even by the standards of TIE-Tangent-class walker vehicles. He found the beast there, the most powerful individual orc in the history of the species, the warlord who had done what no orc had done before or since, and he killed him. The way he killed him was in character, with his hammer, in direct combat, without concern for the aftermath. The Temple Gargant exploded. The explosion should have killed him. Whether it did, permanently or temporarily, is not something the lore resolves clearly. The broader Imperium believes Vulkan died there, finally and permanently, after surviving everything else the universe had thrown at him for thousands of years. The Salamanders do not believe this. Their ongoing search for the artifacts, their maintenance of the Forgefather tradition, their understanding of the Tome of Fire's prophecy, all of it is founded on the conviction that a perpetual cannot be permanently killed by an explosion, however large. Given everything the lore has shown about Vulkan's ability to come back from things that should have permanently ended him, the Salamander's position seems difficult to argue against on the evidence. He came back from nuclear warheads. He came back from vacuum. He came back from Magnus, actively destroying his genetic structure. He came back from the Fulgurite, which specifically stripped him of his perpetual nature, and then he came back again at Deathfire. An explosion, however impressive, does not obviously rank above nuclear warheads on the scale of finality. He is somewhere. The Tome of Fire is specific. The artifacts are real. The quest continues. And somewhere in the galaxy, in whatever quiet form suits a being of his nature and his patience, the Lord of Drakes is waiting for the fire to call him home. Why this story still matters. The strongest case for Vulkan, as the strongest Primarch, is not made in the language of combat statistics or raw physical comparison. It is made in the language of what the story is actually about, which is always and specifically a human story, even when it is told through beings who are far from ordinary humans in almost every measurable way. The Warhammer 40,000 setting is famous for its relentless grimness, the sense that the universe is fundamentally hostile and that human civilization persists only through enormous effort and enormous cost, and that even the institutions meant to protect humanity often harm it in ways that are difficult to grease. Distinguished from the harm inflicted by the enemies, they are protecting against. The Imperium of Man is a theocratic autocracy that tortures and burns and sacrifices millions in the maintenance of a civilization that is genuinely worth saving because the alternatives are genuinely worse. The tension between what the Imperium is and what the people within it deserve sits at the core of everything the setting does. Vulkan is the resolution of that tension, or at least the strongest argument that the tension can be resolved. He is the demonstration that it is possible to be genuinely powerful in every sense that the setting values, physically formidable and tactically capable and strategically significant, while also being genuinely good in the sense that matters most, which is caring about the people you are ostensibly fighting for and showing that care through action that costs you something rather than rhetoric that costs nothing. The setting has produced many characters who are admirable in one of these dimensions or the other. It has produced almost no characters who are both. Vulkan is one of the very few. And what makes him exceptional is not simply that he is both, but that the connection between the two is not accidental. He is effective partly because he cares. The Salamanders are better soldiers because they are better people. The worlds they bring into compliance are more stable because the populations they deal with understand that these warriors actually mean what they say about protection. The relationship between virtue and capability, in Vulkan's case and his legion's case, is not a compromise between two competing goods. It is a single integrated quality. He endured torture not because he was made of stronger physical material than anything Curze had. He endured it because there was nothing in him to break, in the way Curze needed to break him. The thing Curze was trying to destroy, the belief that caring about others was real and not performance, was not a belief that Vulkan held, in the way that beliefs are held consciously and can be consciously surrendered. It was what he was. And you cannot torture someone out of being what they are, because the thing they are is what processes the torture and decides how to respond to it. That is the strongest possible statement of resilience. Not that the force applied was insufficient, but that the target was not the kind of thing that the force was designed to destroy. Curze wanted to reveal the emptiness beneath the compassion. There was no emptiness beneath the compassion. The compassion went all the way down. In a setting that wants you to believe that the galaxy is fundamentally a dark place, where nothing good can last, and everything worthwhile eventually gets ground down into something ugly or simply destroyed, Vulkan is the counter-argument. Not a naive counter-argument that denies the darkness. He has seen more of the darkness than almost anyone who has survived it. He was on Nocturne during the Drukhari raids. He watched what happened on Kara-Atan and made his formal complaint knowing exactly how much weight it would carry. He lost most of his legion on Istvan V. He died dozens of times, in a torture session that lasted months. He watched his closest friend die from across a battlefield that he could not reach in time to save him. He knows the dark. He knows it personally and repeatedly, and in forms that would have destroyed the humanity of most beings who encountered even a fraction of it. And after all of that, he is still the person who stood in the center of Hesiod with his hammers crossed and waited for the predators to come. That is the fire that never goes out. That is why, among all the extraordinary beings that the Primarch project produced, among all the warriors and generals and philosophers and monsters that the Emperor made to lead humanity through the darkness, Vulkan is the one that the darkness could not consume. The strongest one is not always the one who hit hardest. Sometimes it is the one who is still standing when everything else has been consumed, holding the line, turning to face whatever is coming next, still choosing what they chose at the beginning, because who they are has always been the same thing, into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war. The fire that was Vulkan is still burning. And one day, when the last artifact comes home and his sons call to him across the void, it will answer. Section 9. Resurrection at Deathfire and the Journey to Terra. The effort to return Vulkan's body to Nocturne and to Mount Deathfire was long, complicated, and costly. It involved battles against opponents who wanted the body for their own purposes, navigating the extraordinary violence of the heresy without the strength that would have made it straightforward, and carrying the weight of a task that seemed, to any outside observer, more like ritual than practical strategy. Artelis Numeon drove it forward with the same quality that Vulkan himself had modeled on Nocturne, which was simply not stopping. The Promethean cult's understanding of the circle of fire, the belief in death and rebirth through flame, that was the theological foundation of Nocturnian culture, sustained Numeon's conviction that his Primarch could be restored. If there was any Primarch for whom that doctrine might have literal applicability, it was the one whose homeworld was built around that exact cycle, the one whose very name came from a creature that lived in the volcano and emerged unchanged. The journey was harrowing in ways that defied easy summary. The surviving Salamanders fought to preserve the stasis capsule against multiple enemies who recognized what they were carrying and had reasons of their own to want it. They navigated a galaxy in civil war, a handful of warriors against the backdrop of a catastrophe that he had swallowed legions whole. They lost brothers. They kept going. They were, in miniature, exactly what Vulkan had built them to be, the kind of people who endure what they must endure and continue doing what needs to be done, because stopping is simply not an option they recognize. Numeon's final act was to throw himself into the unbound flame, the sacred fire at the heart of Mount Deathfire, as the last necessary sacrifice to restore his Primarch. He died for Vulkan, one dedicated soldier, the last of a company that had stayed together against all odds, giving everything he had left for the hope that his Primarch would return. The Promethean cult would recognize this as the circle of fire made personal. Something enters the flame. Something else, transformed, emerges. Vulkan awoke in the depths of Deathfire. He was not intact. There were gaps in his memory, significant ones, including the gap that covered the events of how he came to be here and who had paid for his return. He spoke to a figure who identified himself as Deathfire, personified, an old man who guided him through the disorientation of an incomplete resurrection and pointed him toward the next thing that needed to be done. This figure would later be revealed as Eldrad Ulthrin in disguise, the Eldar Farseer, who had been manipulating events from a distance, for reasons that extended across centuries of planning and that served purposes that no single conversation could fully illuminate. At the foot of Deathfire, Vulkan found two weapons that had apparently been forged by him in a state of unconscious activity that predated his current memory. Made under the psychic guidance of the Emperor himself, shaped by hands that knew how to make things, even when the mind behind them was not fully present. One was a thunderhammer called Urdrakul, described in the lore as possessing the ability to inflict permanent death on greater daemons, bypassing the regeneration that made such entities essentially unkillable by conventional means. The other was the Talisman of Seven Hammers, a device of significant and specific offensive capability. Both were objects that would prove exactly as useful as they needed to be in the engagement that was coming. He gathered 3 of his Salamanders, the warriors who discovered him at the foot of the mountain, and bound them to secrecy about his return. He named them the Droxward, his personal escort for what was coming. He opened the webway portal that Eldrad had guided him to, buried beneath Deathfire's stone, and he began the journey that the Emperor had apparently been setting up for a very long time, guiding events and people from the Golden Throne toward a destination that only he could fully see. The journey through the webway was not a simple passage from point to point. The alien infrastructure of the oldest travel network in the galaxy was, by the time Vulkan traversed it, a landscape that had already been the site of intense conflict. The war in the webway, the Emperor's secret project gone catastrophically wrong when Magnus's psychic intrusion tore open the seals, had left the webway itself changed and dangerous in ways that the original Eldar builders had never intended. Sections that should have been passageways were now battlegrounds, or worse. Vulkan and the Droxward encountered Drukhari in a satellite realm of Kamara, that infinite labyrinthine city at the edge of the webway, and fought their way through. He encountered the fleet of Shadrach Medusan, still conducting his guerrilla war against Horus's forces, and chose not to be drawn into that conflict, because the Emperor had given him a purpose, and he was holding to it. In the abandoned city of Kalistar within the webway, he faced a greater unclean one, a major daemon of Nurgle that had established itself in the ruins of the ancient architecture. He used the Talisman of Seven Hammers against it and inflicted a true death, a permanent ending for a creature that would normally simply dissipate back to the warp and reconstitute itself in time. The Talisman was, in other words, a weapon specifically designed to permanently end things that were otherwise unkillable. Given that its maker was himself unkillable, there is something almost poetic about that. Eldrad revealed himself as the Old Man of Deathfire, confirmed the nature of what he had been doing and why, and guided Vulkan to the last approach to Terra. Vulkan arrived outside the Imperial Palace during the siege itself, was met by Rogel Dorn, and was taken immediately to the Emperor on the Golden Throne. The Emperor told him 2 things. The first was that Vulkan had a function as a living deadman's switch. In the event that Chaos won the battle for Terra, Vulkan's interaction with the Golden Throne could trigger an annihilation that would deny the traitors their prize entirely. The entire planet obliterated. No victory, no captured machinery, nothing useful left for Horus. This explained why his return had been kept secret, why he had not been announced to the defenders. He was, in the grimly practical language of the heresy's endgame, a last resort. The second thing was more immediate. There was something happening inside the webway, something that only Vulkan could stop. Something that, if it succeeded, would make the question of the outer siege irrelevant, because the defense would fail from the inside. That thing was Magnus the Red. Section 10. The Siege of Terra, Vulkan versus Magnus the Red. The Siege of Terra was the physical manifestation of everything the Horus heresy had been building toward. Outside the walls of the imperial palace, the traitor legions were pressing their assault with a ferocity and a scale that the defenders met with everything they had. Rogel Dorn was directing the defense with the systematic brilliance of the finest military fortifier the galaxy had produced. The Blood Angels and the other loyal forces were fighting and dying in ways that would be remembered for 10,000 years. The outer defenses were holding, but only barely, and the cost of holding them was measured in lives that the Imperium could not afford to lose. And inside the webway, Magnus the Red was working. He had been elevated by Tsanch into a form that was barely recognizable as the scholar who had once debated philosophy and explored the boundaries of psychic understanding with genuine academic passion. He was now an avatar of the chaos god of change, a being of sorcerous power that exceeded almost anything the material realm had encountered outside of the chaos gods themselves. He was in the deepest passages of the webway, enacting a ritual designed to drain the Emperor's already taxed psychic strength, the strength that was the only thing keeping the seals on the webway intact against the demonic pressure on the other side. If the seals failed, the demonic tide would pour through into the heart of the imperial palace itself, not attacking from outside, materializing inside the last defense. Malkador dispatched Vulkan to stop him. There was no one else, not because there was literally no one else available, but because the specific combination of capabilities required could only be met by the 18th Primarch. His physical strength exceeded any other available asset. His perpetual nature, restored by his resurrection at Deathfire, meant he could absorb the psychic and physical damage that Magnus would inflict and keep going. And his specific quality as a being who would not stop, regardless of the cost, made him the only viable candidate for the simple and terrible task of being in Magnus's way, until Magnus was no longer able to continue. Vulkan went into the dark with his hammers and the absolute clarity about what was required. He found Magnus in the impossible geometry of the webway's innermost passages. Magnus was enormous and terrible, and transformed beyond the form he had worn at Prospero, and during the earlier battles of the heresy. He was the Daemon Primarch, in full expression, his single eye, burning with the accumulated power of a god's attention, channeled through a vessel that had been built, over tens of thousands of years of careful manipulation, to serve as exactly this kind of weapon. He beheaded Vulkan. Vulkan regenerated. He suffocated Vulkan by turning his lungs to amber, filling the breathing passages with solid material from within. Vulkan regenerated. He drained the blood from Vulkan's body, using his psychic mastery over biological matter to simply remove the substance that kept Vulkan's biology functional. Vulkan regenerated. He immolated Vulkan with psychic fire, the kind that is made of the warped substance rather than ordinary chemistry, that burns not just the physical body but reaches for the soul within it. Vulkan regenerated. This is the sequence that defines what it means to say Vulkan is unkillable. Not unkillable in the sense that he is hard to hurt. He was hurt. Every single one of Magnus's attacks worked on a physical level. Beheading kills. Suffocation kills. Exsanguination kills. Psychic fire kills. They all worked. Vulkan died from each of them. The difference is that dying, for Vulkan, is a pause, a very brief interruption, and then he is back, and the attrition continues working against the person who was counting on the death to stick. Magnus grew increasingly desperate. A being of extraordinary psychic power, capable of reality-warping feats that few living things could match, was being run into the ground by a man with hammers who simply would not stay dead. The equation was turning against Magnus with every revival, because Magnus was spending tremendous psychic energy trying to kill something that refused to be killed, and Vulkan was spending almost no energy at all, just enduring and recovering and continuing to apply pressure with the quiet, relentless determination of someone who has outlasted nuclear warheads and months of systematic torture, and has learned, experientially, that the thing to do is simply not stop. Magnus tried a different approach. He entered Vulkan's mind, because Magnus was Magnus, and direct assault having failed, he would try another angle. He appeared not as a daemon thing of Tsanch, but as the person he had been before, the scholar, the intellectual, the brilliant and reckless brother who had made catastrophic choices with genuinely good intentions. He tried to explain himself. To make Vulkan understand why the choices had seemed necessary, why chaos had seemed like a door worth walking through, why the power was worth the price, Vulkan was not unsympathetic. He said so directly. He admitted that he might have made similar choices in similar circumstances. He extended genuine human empathy to a being who had arguably earned it. And then he came back swinging, because he could also see, clearly and without illusion, what Magnus had become and what Magnus was still trying to do. His compassion and his determination to do what was necessary were not in conflict. They were aspects of the same larger quality, the ability to see things clearly and respond to what is actually there rather than what would be more comfortable. Magnus's final assault was the most powerful thing he could do. He did not aim it at Vulkan's body. He aimed it at Vulkan's nature, at the genetic structure that underpinned the perpetual ability. He attacked Vulkan at a molecular level, trying to unravel the very code that allowed him to come back from death, to literally unmake what the Emperor had made him. The attack worked in the sense that it achieved its stated objective. Vulkan's DNA was being actively destroyed at a genetic level. He was falling apart in a way that went below the physical and into the structural. He was becoming a disintegrating, immolated ruin, still conscious enough to perceive what was happening, still present enough to understand that this time the regeneration might not come back in time. He was still swinging. Magnus, standing in the moment of what should have been his triumph, with the evidence of Vulkan's dissolution visible in front of him, in the arrogant certainty that understanding something deeply is the same as having won, was not paying sufficient attention to the hammer. It connected. The blow that Vulkan delivered while literally in the process of disintegrating, while Magnus was delivering his killing stroke and believing it to be successful, hit Magnus in the head with the force of the physically strongest Primarch, wielding a weapon that had been forged specifically to permanently kill things that should not be killable. The Crimson King fell, the ritual collapsed, the seals held. Vulkan fell next to him. Sometime later, something that was barely recognizable as Vulkan, a partial reconstruction of a person still regenerating from damage that had been more fundamental than any he had previously survived, made its way out of the webway. He had won. The method of the winning, absorbing the absolute worst that one of the most powerful psychic entities in the galaxy could produce, and continuing to swing the hammer until the job was done, is the definitive statement of everything that makes Vulkan the strongest Primarch. Not the flashiest, not the most elegant, not the method that will be celebrated in epic verse alongside the great duels and the great speeches and the great moments of heroic sacrifice that the heresy produced in abundance, but the method that worked when nothing else would, against an opponent that nothing else could have stopped. The method of simply continuing through every impossible obstacle until the thing that needed doing was done. That is strength. Section 11. The 9 artifacts and the prophecy of return. After the heresy ended and the great scouring began, the Salamanders faced the most difficult form of rebuilding any legion has ever had to undertake. They had started the heresy as a legion of tens of thousands. They ended it as a remnant of hundreds, having bled not just at Istvan V but across every engagement they fought during the years of the Civil War itself. The scouring required every available force, including whatever remained of Vulkan's sons, and they gave everything they had while simultaneously trying to rebuild enough strength to remain a viable entity. Vulkan was present for some of this period. He walked with his legion through the immediate aftermath, provided guidance in the rebuilding, participated in the discussions about Guilliman's Codex Astartes and how the new Imperium should structure its military. He was reportedly among those who had reservations about the mandatory division of the old legions into smaller chapters, though his reservations were rooted in the practical reality that the Salamanders had been reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The Codex was designed for legions with tens of thousands of warriors to split into roughly 1,000 warrior chapters. The Salamanders did not have tens of thousands. And then, roughly 1,000 years after the heresy, Vulkan disappeared. He left behind the Tome of Fire. The Tome of Fire is not a single book. That name is misleading in its singularity, because what Vulkan left was an entire archive of material, dozens of volumes bound in drakeskin, scrolls, charts, artistic renderings, and stranger objects, all of it stored in the Salamanders' fortress monastery on Prometheus, the moon of Nocturne. The tome contained wisdom and prophecy and guidance written over Vulkan's long life. According to Salamander's tradition, some of it was written in Vulkan's own blood, and the ink shimmered like captured fire when brought to the light. And encoded within its many volumes, hidden in riddles and encrypted passages that would take centuries to fully unravel, were the locations of 9 sacred artifacts that Vulkan had forged, one last time, before his departure. The philosophy behind the artifacts is worth understanding in full, because it illuminates something important about Vulkan's character. Before he set the artifacts aside as a test for his sons, he had intended to destroy them all. His entire vault of weapons and devices, everything he had made across a long and extraordinarily productive life, was something he had decided needed to be eliminated rather than passed down. Horus's fall, the example of what happened when even the greatest of the Emperor's children went wrong, had shown him that the best weapons in the wrong hands were worse than no weapons at all. He told Tekel, his forge master, that he was going to destroy everything. Tekel argued with him. He said that the weapons represented Vulkan's legacy, that they could be used for good as easily as they could be misused, that destroying them was a form of surrender to the fear of misuse. Vulkan, who understood the argument and accepted its logic, modified his position. He relented on total destruction. He allowed Tekel to choose 7 artifacts to preserve. The rest would be destroyed. The 7 would be hidden, and they could only be recovered by those who proved themselves worthy of them through the test of finding them. The condition that a Forge Father would be chosen, that this warrior would renounce their own name and take Vulkan's, that the search for the artifacts would be the defining purpose of this warrior's life, was not theater. It was Vulkan's way of ensuring that the people who eventually wielded his work would be the people most clearly aligned with what he had stood for. Not the strongest, not the most famous, the most dedicated, the most patient, the most willing to sacrifice everything, including their own identity, in service to something larger than themselves. In a sense, warriors shaped in his own image. The Forge Father who has served longest in the current era of the 41st millennium is Vulkan Histan. Once the captain of the 4th Company, he abandoned his name when chosen and took his Primarchs, becoming the living carrier of that legacy in the most literal way available. He has been searching for the missing artifacts for decades, following the clues in the Tome of Fire across the galaxy, into the most dangerous regions of known space and beyond. The 5 artifacts that have been recovered tell a story through their names and descriptions. The Spear of Vulkan, a power weapon whose blade burns hot enough to set ceramite itself on fire. Kezere's Mantle, the scaled cloak made from a fire drake's hide, carrying the creature's famous resistance to destruction. The Gauntlet of the Forge, an armored gauntlet incorporating a heavy flamer that Histan himself recovered personally from the grip of an Eldar Corsair Lord in direct combat. The Chalice of Fire, a forge ship of extraordinary manufacturing capability, recovered drifting in deep space after spending millennia separated from any keeper. The Eye of Vulkan, a defense laser of fearsome power, still attached to the chalice when the ship was found, now serving as an orbital defense asset above Prometheus. The 4 missing artifacts are known only by name, their forms and functions locked in the encrypted passages of the Tome of Fire. The Engine of Woes, about which the tome says only that its wrath has never been unleashed. The Obsidian Chariot, described as having armor near impregnable. The Song of Entropy, a drake-headed staff that produces an entropic beam which no defense can resist. And the Unbound Flame, described as a device both terrible and wonderful. The name carved into the side of the stasis capsule that carried Vulkan's body back from Makrag, perhaps a reflection of what Vulkan himself is. The prophecy in the Tome of Fire is specific about the conditions for Vulkan's return. When the Forge Father has recovered all 9 artifacts and returned them to Nocturne, Vulkan will judge whether his sons are worthy of his leadership. The judgment is not automatic. The recovery of the artifacts is a necessary but not sufficient condition. The Primarch will look at what his chapter has become in the 10,000 years of his absence and decide whether they are the warriors he intended to make them. Whether the Promethean creed still lives in their actions and not just their prayers. Whether the protection of humanity is still their genuine first concern rather than a ceremonial tradition they carry without really believing it. The Salamanders know this. They know that the search for the artifacts is also, in every engagement they fight, and every choice they make about how to fight it, an ongoing demonstration of who they are. He Stand's quest is not separate from the chapter's daily practice of being the Salamanders. It is the highest and most formal expression of it. And every time a salamander charges into a burning building to pull out a civilian who would otherwise die, every time they take the more costly line of advance to avoid collateral damage, every time they treat an ordinary person as someone whose life genuinely matters rather than as backdrop for a war they would be fighting regardless, they are adding their argument to the case that will be considered when all 9 artifacts come home. He Stan has followed the trail into Imperium Nihilus, the region of the galaxy cut off from Terra's light by the Great Rift. He has fought the Alpha Legion for a fragment of intelligence about the Unbound Flame's location and found the intelligence had been planted as a trap. He has lost warriors in pursuit of single clues. He has spent years on dead ends. And he continues, because that is what the sons of Vulkan do. They continue, they accept the cost, they keep going toward the thing that matters. The 4 missing artifacts are out there. The Tome of Fire says they can be found. And somewhere out there, the Lord of Drakes himself is waiting for the moment when the search is complete and the question of whether his sons are worthy can finally be asked. Section 12. Why Vulkan is the strongest Primarch. The complete case. Let us now build the full case, because the opening question deserves a proper answer, and the evidence accumulated across Vulkan's story makes that answer possible in a way that no single fact alone could achieve. The first dimension is physical strength, in the most direct and measurable sense. Across all the lore, across the novels and codices and campaign supplements that have described the Primarchs in combat, the consistent attribution for Vulkan is that he is the physically strongest among the Emperor's sons. Not among the strongest, not in the upper tier, the strongest. He stands taller and broader than his brothers. His raw lifting capacity and endurance in purely physical tests exceed those of every other Primarch for whom comparable data exists. The 8-day contest with the Emperor, in which both contestants held iron anvils above their heads for half a day without finding a reason to stop, demonstrates a baseline of physical capability defined not by the limits of what Vulkan could manage, but by the limits of what he chose to impose on himself, since neither he nor his opponent had apparently found their ceiling. This physical superiority translates into combat capability that is genuine and substantial. When Vulkan hits things, the things feel it in the way that the physically mightiest of the Emperor's sons hitting things produces. His warhammer Erdrakul is described as possessing enough power to shatter even the metallic arms of Ferrus Manus, and to inflict permanent death on greater daemons, bypassing the regenerative immortality that makes such entities essentially unkillable by lesser means. His standard armament, in the forms that various periods of his career saw him equipped with, included weapons that he made himself to standards that no other smith could replicate. The second dimension is the perpetual nature, and this is where Vulkan's position becomes truly unique in a way that cannot be reduced to a matter of degree. No other Primarch is a perpetual. This is not a contested claim. The Emperor chose, among all 20 of his sons, to give this specific gift to one of them. The fact that Vulkan is the one the Emperor deemed worthy of his own unique form of immortality is itself a statement about how the most powerful mind in human history evaluated the value and character of each of his children. The practical implications in combat are enormous. The ability to absorb lethal damage repeatedly and continue is not simply an advantage in extended engagements. It changes the fundamental nature of what an opponent can accomplish. Sanguinius died at Horus's hands because the damage Horus inflicted was terminal. Ferrus Manus died at Fulgrim's hands for the same reason. Even among the greatest Primarchs, death is a real possibility with real consequences. For Vulkan, it is a temporary inconvenience. Every enemy that faces him is fighting a battle in which the most common and decisive method of winning, killing the opposing commander, is simply not available. They can kill Vulkan. They cannot keep him dead. The proof of this is not theoretical. It is demonstrated repeatedly and specifically across some of the most extreme conditions available in the lore: nuclear warheads, decapitation, vacuum, exsanguination, the psychic fire of a daemon Primarch, the genetic level unraveling of his own DNA by one of the most powerful psychic entities in the galaxy's history. All of these worked, in the sense that they all produce the biological state of death in Vulkan's body. None of them worked in the sense that matters, because he came back from all of them. The third dimension is what might be called endurance of identity. And this is where the concept of strength becomes something that transcends the physical entirely. The extended torture at Curze's hands was not a test of physical capability. It was a sustained, expert, months-long effort to destroy who Vulkan was. To use overwhelming pain and death and revival and death again to break down the character that had been built over a lifetime, to find the point where Vulkan would crack and confirm the nihilistic worldview that Curze needed him to confirm. Vulkan did not crack, not because he was too strong to feel what was being done to him. He felt it. He died from it, repeatedly and awfully. But the person he was, the values he carried, the care for others that was the foundation of everything he did, those did not change. He came back from each death as himself, intact, choosing, each time, to continue being who he was, rather than becoming what the torture wanted him to become. That is the rarest kind of strength, the kind that has no biological name, because it is not a property of the body. It is a property of the person. And it is perhaps the most significant thing Vulkan demonstrates across all of his lore, because it is the thing that could not be forged in any lab or trained in any exercise yard. It had to be built through character, over time, through the values that Nocturne and Nenbel and the people of Hesiod put into him before the galaxy knew he existed. The fourth dimension is the breadth and depth of capability that Vulkan brings to every situation he enters. He is not simply a weapons platform with an unusual ability to recover from damage. He is one of the two greatest weaponsmiths in Imperial history. His intelligence is of the kind that the lore reserves for the most extraordinary minds, the kind that can take a situation apart and see it clearly and respond to what is actually there rather than what doctrine or habit suggests should be there. He advanced the technological knowledge of an entire planet's craftsman tradition in months. He produced weapons and devices of such extraordinary capability that he eventually decided some of them were too dangerous to leave in the world. He fought Magnus the Red, a being of near unlimited psychic power, specifically enhanced to serve as a weapon of a chaos god, and he beat him through the application of physical strength and absolute refusal to stay dead, brought to bear against a target that had all the power of a chaos god's attention and thought it had already won. The fifth dimension is legacy, and it may be the most important one. A Primarch's strength is partly measured by what persists after them, by what they were able to build that outlasts their physical presence. The Salamanders, in the 41st millennium, 10,000 years after Vulkan's departure, are still recognizably the legion he made. The Promethean Creed is not a ceremonial tradition preserved in the way that some chapters preserve ancient traditions, saying the words while forgetting the meaning. It is a living practice, expressed in the daily choices that Salamander's warriors make about how to fight and who to protect and what to prioritize when the costs have to be distributed somewhere. They live among the people of Nocturne between campaigns, not in remote fortresses, but in bastions within the sanctuary cities, present in the communities they protect. They grieve their dead as individuals with names and stories, rather than as statistics in a casualty report. They take the more costly path in engagements when taking it means fewer civilians die. They go out of their way to pull people out of burning buildings when every other calculation says there is not time. In a setting defined by its grimness, by the relentless demonstration that idealism corrodes and virtue is too expensive to maintain in the face of an uncaring universe, the Salamanders are a standing argument that something better is possible. That the forge-made values of a man who learned about strength from a blacksmith on a volcanic death world are durable enough to survive 10,000 years of the galaxy's worst attempts to make everything worse. That protection is not a naive fantasy, but a practical orientation that produces warriors who fight harder and more effectively because they know what they are protecting and they care about it in ways that are specific and personal, rather than abstract and rhetorical. That is the argument Vulkan's legacy makes. And the fact that it is still being made by warriors who carry his gene seed but were born 10,000 years after he last walked among them is perhaps the most impressive demonstration of his strength that the entire lore contains. The sixth and final dimension returns us to where we began, the nature of strength itself. Vulkan is the strongest Primarch, not because he wins every duel, not because he is unkillable, though he is, and the practical implications of that are enormous. Not because his craftsmanship produced the most powerful weapons, though it did. He is the strongest because strength, in its fullest sense, is the ability to be what you are, under every pressure that exists, to make you something else. And no pressure that has ever been applied to Vulkan has succeeded in making him something else. The Volcano tried. The Drukhari tried. The Great Crusade offered endless opportunities to adopt the more expedient approaches that other Primarchs used, and he declined every one. Konrad Curze tried, systematically and expertly and for months, with every instrument of physical and psychological torture available, and he failed. Magnus tried, with the power of a chaos god behind him and the specific weapon of Vulkan's own genetic structure as his final attack, and he failed too. Nothing has made Vulkan into something Vulkan is not. Nothing has erased the person who grew up in Nembel's forge and chose to stand in the center of Hesiod and refused to hide, not even the 10,000 years of war and absence, and the accumulated grief of everything he has witnessed and everything he has lost. He is somewhere. The lore is deliberately ambiguous about exactly where and exactly in what state, which is appropriate for a being whose story is not yet finished. The Tome of Fire is real. The artifacts are real. The prophecy is real in the sense that it is what the Salamanders believe and what the lore takes seriously. 4 artifacts remain. The Forge Father is searching. And whatever quiet place the Lord of Drakes currently occupies, whether it is a specific corner of the galaxy where he tends the fire and waits, or something more active and less describable, he is waiting for the moment when the search is complete, and the question of whether his sons are worthy can finally be asked. The answer, given 10,000 years of evidence, seems likely to be yes, into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war. That is the creed. That is the legacy. That is the promise that Vulkan made to his people on Nocturne before he knew what he was, and that the Salamanders have been keeping ever since. To stand in the center when the predators come, and not hide, and face whatever is there with the skill and the strength and the fire that Nocturne put into them. The forge is still burning. The fire never goes out. The smith who descended from the sky in a comet of fire is still out there, somewhere in the dark between the stars, carrying his hammers and his values, and the stubborn indestructibility of someone who simply refuses to be permanently ended by anything the universe has tried. The unbound flame, waiting to be called home. His sons are calling. They have been calling for 10,000 years. One day the volcano will answer. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for spending that time here. If Vulkan's lore hit you the way we hoped it would, if the image of someone who cannot be broken and refuses to give up on the people he fights for means something to you, please leave a like on the video. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who would appreciate it. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is exactly the right moment. More deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, more stories told at this pace, more quiet hours in the universe of the far future are on the way. Go well, keep the fire burning. End of script. The brothers he lost, and the brothers he kept. No account of Vulkan is complete without a serious look at the relationships that defined his place among the Primarchs, because those relationships are the human register of a story that can otherwise become too cosmic in scale to feel real. Vulkan was not simply a being of extraordinary power moving through history. He was someone who loved his brothers, grieved their loss, tried to maintain what was good in the relationships, even when the larger politics made that increasingly difficult, and eventually had to watch most of what he loved be destroyed in the space of a single day, on a world he should never have needed to visit. Ferrus Manus was the relationship that the lore treats with most care and most specific detail, and for good reason. The two of them shared a passion for craftsmanship that was, in both cases, not simply a skill, but something close to a spiritual practice. The things they made were expressions of who they were and what they valued. When Vulkan and Ferrus held smithing contests, the goal was not simply to determine who was the better craftsman in some narrow technical sense. It was to push each other toward what neither could reach alone, to use the specifics of what each was making as a provocation to the other's imagination and ability. The products of those contests were among the finest objects produced during the entire Great Crusade. Ferrus gave Vulkan the furnace's heart, made it himself, with his own hands that were themselves part metal, put into it the quality of attention that he brought to everything he made that mattered. The fact that Vulkan carried it despite not being a natural plasma pistol user is the most straightforward possible statement of what the object meant. Not a tactical preference, but a carried friendship. When Ferrus died at Isstvan V, seeking the confrontation with Fulgrim that his anger and grief demanded, and that Horus had calculated he would seek, the weapon became a carried absence. Something to hold rather than something to use, though Vulkan used it anyway, because putting it away would have felt like a second burial. Sanguinius was another relationship that carried weight. The Blood Angels Primarch and the Salamanders Primarch shared something that their more calculating or more rage-driven brothers did not. The specific combination of extraordinary physical power with a genuine gentleness that was not weakness, but its own kind of strength. Sanguinius was luminous and tragic in ways that Vulkan was not. The shadow in the warp bearing down on the beautiful angel in ways that gave his every action a quality of knowing sacrifice. But in the period before those shadows deepened, the two of them shared the experience of being beings of great capability who had not lost the capacity to be moved by ordinary human things. They valued what they were protecting in the specific and personal way, rather than the abstract and rhetorical way. That similarity created a recognition, a sense of genuine kinship beyond the brotherhood that all Primarchs technically shared. Guilliman, the cold and systematic architect of the Imperium's legal and institutional foundations, and Vulkan shared something less emotional and more intellectual. But it was real. Guilliman understood what Vulkan was building with the Promethean Creed in a way that his more strategically focused analysis allowed him to appreciate: a sustainable culture, a set of values designed to persist across time, rather than depending on the continued presence of any individual to enforce them. The institutions Guilliman built served a similar purpose. When Vulkan found himself in Guilliman's chambers on Macraga, placed in a stasis capsule by the Master of Ultramar's own hands, with those two words carved into its side, the gesture was from one builder to another, an acknowledgement that what Vulkan represented was worth preserving. And then there were the brothers he lost, not to death, but to worse things. Curze, who had been twisted into something that his original self might not have recognized, carrying the accumulated damage of a lightless childhood on Nostromo and the specific horror of prophetic vision that could not be escaped or altered. Fulgrim, who had been a being of genuine beauty and artistic sensitivity before the corruption that took him and made him the vessel for a daemon. These were not simply enemies. They were brothers who had gone wrong in ways that the lore takes seriously, that involve real tragedy underneath the horror of what they became. Vulkan's confrontation with Curze on Karatin was not simply a disagreement between commanders with different operational philosophies. It was a confrontation between two profoundly different answers to the same fundamental question. What does the worst of what life can do to you reveal about what you are? Curze's answer was that it reveals the emptiness beneath the performances of virtue. Vulkan's answer, the answer that his entire life had demonstrated before Curze ever got hold of him, was that what the worst can do to you is exactly what reveals the core that remains when everything else has been stripped away, and that core does not have to be empty. Curze needed Vulkan to confirm his thesis. Vulkan's existence denied it, not theoretically or rhetorically. The denial was lived and demonstrated, and ultimately proved under the specific and terrible laboratory conditions of months of systematic torture. Whatever else you can say about Konrad Curze's philosophy, the experiment was conducted rigorously, and the results were unambiguous. The thing Vulkan had that Curze could not destroy was not a belief that Vulkan held. It was Vulkan. The man, the person, the specific individual whose childhood and choices and loves and griefs had assembled themselves into someone for whom caring about others was not a layer on top of some more fundamental self, but the most fundamental thing there was. You cannot torture that out of someone any more than you can heat-treat steel until it stops being made of iron. The Salamanders in the Age of the Dark Imperium, the Great Rift tore the galaxy in two in 999, M41. The Astronomican's light was interrupted. Warp storms of unprecedented scale separated the Imperium into an eastern half that retained connection to Terra and a western half, the Imperium Nihilus, that was cut off from the light of the Golden Throne. The Indomitus Crusade under Robert Guillemot launched to address the catastrophe, bringing the new Primaris Space Marines as reinforcements to chapters that had been reduced by 10,000 years of constant warfare. The Salamanders received Primaris reinforcements and, more significantly, new successor chapters founded from their gene seed, the Covenant of Fire and the Hammers of Nocturne, among others. For the first time in the history of the artifact search, Histan is not conducting it alone. His new successor chapters have committed companies to the search, following the leads that the Tome of Fire provides across the darkened half of the galaxy. The world called Zero was the most recent significant episode in Histan's quest. He had intelligence from sources that he had reason to trust, suggesting it contained a clue to the location of the Unbound Flame, the most cryptically named and most discussed of the 4 remaining artifacts. What he found was the Alpha Legion, who had penetrated the Hammers of Nocturne's chain of command and used their position to lure Histan to a world that served the enemy's purposes, rather than his. It was a trap of the kind the Alpha Legion specializes in, using a target's own motivations against them, making the thing they genuinely want lead them somewhere they genuinely should not go. Histan survived. The Alpha Legion's local operation did not. He pushed deeper into the Imperium Nihilus rather than retreating, because that is what the Forge Father does. Every Forge Father before Histan has spent a lifetime searching without finding everything. Most have found nothing at all. Histan has found 3 artifacts in his own tenure, more than most, and he has been prepared since the day he took the title that failure is the most likely outcome of any given lead. You go anyway. You take the risk. You push through the trap and out the other side and keep moving toward the next clue. The Tome of Fire describes the Unbound Flame as both terrible and wonderful. Of all the missing artifacts, it is the one whose description most clearly resonates with the name that was carved into the side of Vulkan's stasis capsule on Macrage. Whether the device called the Unbound Flame and the quality called the Unbound Flame that the Salamanders associate with their Primarch are the same thing, connected things, or a coincidence that the lore is deliberately cultivating as a mystery, remains to be resolved. It is possible that the Unbound Flame artifact, when found, will tell Histan something about where Vulkan is that the other artifacts have not told him. What the Salamanders know, with the certainty of 10,000 years of maintained faith, is that the fire is not out. The Primarch, who came from a comet of fire, who regenerated from nuclear warheads and vacuum and the deliberate molecular destruction of his own genetics, who killed Magnus the Red while literally disintegrating, does not simply cease to exist because a temple gargant exploded. The tome says he will return. The Salamanders believe the tome, and they have earned the right to that belief through 10,000 years of being exactly the warriors the tome describes, the ones who take the costly path, who endure what must be endured, who keep going toward the fire even when the fire seems impossibly far away. Histan is out there, in the darkness of the Imperium Nihilus, following a trail that has already led him into Alpha Legion traps and dead ends, and years of searching that produced nothing, and he is still going. One more Salamander, doing what Salamanders do, refusing to stop. The fire always comes back. That is the promise. That is the creed. That is the deepest truth that Nocturne's history and Vulkan's life, and 10,000 years of his son's practice, have accumulated into something that the grimness of the setting cannot quite reach. Into the fires of battle, indeed, but out the other side, still swinging, still burning. The Lord of Drakes is out there. And one day, when the last hammer comes home to Nocturne, and the fire is finally complete, you will know him by the light. A final word on the forge and the fire. There is something that this story does that very few stories in the Warhammer 40,000 setting manage to do, and it is worth naming before we close, because it is the thing that keeps bringing people back to Vulkan specifically, even in a setting populated by figures of extraordinary drama and power and tragedy. Most of the great figures in the lore are defined by what they cannot do. Sanguinius cannot escape the shadow in the warp, cannot avoid the death that prophecy has already written. Horus cannot resist the corruption that found the wound his pride left open. Magnus cannot undo the consequences of the choices his brilliance told him were justified. Even Guilliman, the most pragmatic and capable administrator the species produced, cannot read the Codex Astartes without weeping, because he built the document knowing he would not be there to guide its application and could only hope the words were enough. The great figures of the heresy are defined by the specific and agonizing gap between who they could have been and who the circumstances allowed them to become. Vulkan does not have that gap. Or rather, the gap that exists in his story runs the other direction. Not the distance between potential and failure, but the distance between what the galaxy did to him and what it could not do to him. Every terrible thing that happened to Vulkan, the Drukhari raids, the loss of his legion, the death of his closest friend, the months of torture, the repeated dying and coming back and dying again, the confrontation with a chaos-empowered Magnus that literally dissolved him at a molecular level, all of those things are in the story. None of them changed who he was. That is the gap. The distance between what the universe threw at him and what it managed to take from him. The answer to that distance is zero. It took nothing. He came back from everything as the same person who had stood in the center of Hesiod with 2 smithing hammers and refused to hide. In a setting where characters are routinely defined by their corruption or their tragedy or their limitation, a character who simply cannot be corrupted or tragically undone or limited by anything the galaxy has tried is genuinely unusual. He is not invulnerable to pain. He is not incapable of loss. He is not naive about the darkness. He simply does not let any of those things change the answer to the most fundamental question about who he is. That stubbornness, that absolute and almost geological persistence of self, is the final thing that makes him the strongest. The physical strength and the immortality and the craftsmanship and the legacy are all real and all significant. But underneath all of those things is the thing that made them possible. A person who decided, in the specific early morning of his existence as a conscious being, that he was going to stand in the center and face what came, and never revisited that decision regardless of what came. 10,000 years of war, and he is still standing in the center. That is Vulkan. That is the 18th Primarch, the Lord of Drakes, the Unbound Flame, the strongest of the Emperor's sons. The hammer is still in his hand. The fire never goes out. The gene seed and what it carries. One detail that often gets passed over in the broader conversation about Vulkan and the Salamanders is what the gene seed itself does to the warriors who receive it, because the physical transformation that Nocturne's radiation and Vulkan's genetics produce is one of the most visually distinctive in the entire Space Marine project, and it tells a story in itself. The melanchromic organ, the component of the Space Marine gene seed that regulates skin pigmentation in response to environmental radiation, reacts to Nocturne's extraordinary radiation levels with an intensity that no other world produces. The result is absolute. The warriors of the Salamanders develop skin so completely dark that it does not reflect light in the way that darkness normally reflects light. Their eyes become red, burning with a faint internal luminescence that makes them visible in the dim volcanic twilight that constitutes most of Nocturne's outdoor light. They look, and the lore says this directly, like they came out of fire, like they were made in the forge, the same way the weapons they carry were made, subjected to the same heat and pressure and transformation, and came out the other side as something that heat and pressure cannot easily undo. This is not incidental visual design. In a setting where the visual is always carrying symbolic weight, the Salamander's appearance is a walking argument for what they are. The warriors of other chapters can, in certain lights and at certain distances, look like the humans they were before their transformation. The Salamanders do not. They look like what they became. They look like Nocturne made them, and Nocturne's making is the making of things that endure. The recruitment process that produces these warriors is itself an expression of Vulkan's values. Children of 6 or 7 are selected and begin serving in the forge of a Salamander's warrior, not yet initiates, not yet undergoing the full transformation, but beginning the relationship with craft and fire that the Promethean creed places at the center of Salamander's identity. They watch, they learn, they work, and over years, those who survive the physical challenges and prove themselves in character as well as capability begin the full process of becoming a Space Marine. The trials include a grueling march across Nocturne's ash wastes, through terrain that is actively hostile in the specific and measurable way that a world being torn apart by volcanic activity several times every century tends to be actively hostile. The native fauna, which has adapted to this environment, is not forgiving. The atmospheric conditions are not forgiving. The time of trial, if it falls during the testing period, is not forgiving. What comes through all of that, again and again, is a specific kind of person, someone who did not give up when giving up would have been the rational choice. That is who Vulkan built his legion from. Not the fastest, or the most naturally gifted, or the most technically capable. The ones who did not stop. The ones who kept going through the ash wastes and the volcanic heat and the predators and the impossible conditions until they came out the other side, still carrying whatever they had carried into the test. The echo of that process in everything the Salamanders do, and in everything Vulkan himself did, is not subtle. The same quality that carries a child across an ash waste without stopping carried Vulkan through months of systematic torture without breaking. The same quality that allows a salamander to take the more costly path in a battle because it keeps the civilians alive is the quality that kept Vulkan swinging when Magnus was literally dismantling his DNA. The Legion is built from a consistent material, and that material is the kind of person who does not stop. Vulkan knew what he was doing when he designed the recruitment process. He built it to find the people who already had the quality he valued most, and then gave them the tools and the tradition to express that quality in the most effective and most human way possible. The result, 10,000 years later, is still the Salamanders. Still the chapter that goes into the burning buildings. Still the warriors who take the costly path. Still the sons of the man who stood in the center of Hesiod and waited for whatever was coming with his smithing hammers crossed over his shoulders. The fire is in the gene seed. The fire is in the training. The fire is in the creed. And the fire, as Nocturne has always understood it, does not go out. It waits, sometimes, under the ash and the cooling stone. It waits for the right conditions, for the fuel and the air and the spark that will let it breathe again. And then it comes back, exactly as hot as it was, because that is what fire is. That is what Vulkan is. The hammer is still in his hand, the forge is still burning, and somewhere out in the galaxy, following the clues that 10,000 years of careful reading have extracted from the Tome of Fire, the Forge Father searches for the last 4 pieces of the puzzle that will bring their Primarch home. One day, the fire will answer, into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war.